And then when we get on, I'm going to ask you to do a favor and take over for a few minutes, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes or 6, 7 minutes at the longest. I'm just going to grab my, I'm just going to.
Okay, okay, yeah, it's streaming now, so yeah, so go do your stuff,
Yeah, just take over.
and I'll
Yeah,
be
yeah, I'll be back.
I'll,
Yeah, let people know
I'll sort of wait
we're trying to
till
normalize, and
till all the
you can
people
take
gather.
advantage of this time to also.
So yeah, go ahead. I'm gonna just
and
gather.
put the link up again. Put the link up again on the.
I will. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll be right back. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Hi everybody. So I had a quick power out in the whole house here, and so everything, the encoder went offline and the stream got disrupted. So I just got a hold of Douglas, and we're just restarting the whole stream. He's gonna take a few minutes to just take care of things and refresh, I guess, and he'll be back. He said something like 5 minutes. So I'm just gonna. I gotta get my browser started and everything. I had to. So my computer is rebooted, so I'm just starting things back up. And I only know that it's streaming because the encoder tells me I'm streaming. There's my browser. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna send the link back to Douglas's timeline. It will sort of be the same one, just that I don't exactly know how YouTube has it organized, how they divvy up the space. YouTube strikes me as the most, not the most, but as a lot of these organizations, sort of idiosyncratic, in that when I was trying to fill out something for to send to YouTube, they have like these absolute massive character limits of something like 100 or 200 character limit to send like a complaint or something. And I thought it's so weird to like limit it at such a low number. I mean, I suppose reading it all, but they must have so much space to house all these videos. Yet the character limit is like 100 characters. And it struck me. Oh, okay, so let me see. So 2 people, 4 people. Okay. So it'll take a little bit of while to establish that we're back online. So I'm gonna get the link instead of babbling here. Yeah. So that was a pretty big disruption. Nobody knew what happened. So again, what occurred was that I had a complete blackout in my house. It was just a spike, some kind of a, everything went offline and it came right back on. So the power kicked back in, and the internet stayed up when I rebooted my computer and reconnected. Let's see here. And Douglas feels he wanted to continue, so I restarted the live stream, and we're going to continue. There's a couple of messages. I'm just gonna throw this Douglas's way. I haven't been spending much time on Facebook during these transmissions because I found that it kind of interfered with some of the sound. Actually, the scrolling in the browser. But alright, so second, I'll title it second. Yeah, we had a lot of rain and fog. Roll through here, through the region. And it's probably I told Douglas about this, that there might be some disruptions tonight possibly, because a lot of water is, those people who live in like kind of rainy regions know that it can take out the power line. The transformers can spark and things like that. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, and Douglas. Yeah. So again, I'll throw it onto Douglas's timeline. I don't even. I'll let him do the other one. So I think this is going to his personal friends timeline. Though, oh, it is different. Okay, so yeah, people will have to vote. That's why we were waiting for people to reconnect, because though it'll show up on his YouTube page, if people who just get it through Facebook won't be able to get it, because it is a new new link, new live link. So this will be broken up.
Okay, I am returned. What were you saying?
All right, so yeah, just so people. So I was about to say that Douglas will return, but I just realized it is a new link, so we have to wait for a little bit of time for the people to find their way to it. They're slowly starting to find their way back, but still not as many as were there before. So I've posted it to one of your timelines and linked it up. So you might want to post it to the other one as well. See if you can.
Oh, good idea. Good idea. Yes, let me do that, and I'll pin it to.
Yeah, I'll post it into your into our connection.
I'm sorry.
I'll post it into.
Yes. Yeah. Put it into my Skype text box. Yes. Thank you.
So yeah,
of course, I can't understand half of what Pavel says when he comes over that thing.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. But I was just explaining about all the rain and the fog that was coming through and causing possible disturbance, electrical disturbance. So okay, so that's the link. So yeah, so we're live. That's where we are live now. That's a brand new link. And
okay, we are. Great. We are live, and I am back, and I want to thank our executive producer. He is the man. He has literally kept things going while I was gone. The power went out in his home. I hope you had a chance to tell people this.
That I started to relate that a little bit, but I was trying to type and like check things. So, you know, it was like the last little bits to check before takeoff. But yeah, otherwise I think I did relate that. As best as I could.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, our man. And so he's got this link here, and I've got it pretty much. So let me just publish that and pin it to the top, and this will probably help immensely for people, or should. So let me just do away with all of the niceties here. Refresh the page, and here we are. Second attempt, live stream link, and that's from Pavel. And what I'll do is I'll follow up with my own here. It may be repetitive, but it will help bring people to us. And though it'll be more visible simply because I posted it. And they're back online now, thanks. Somebody posted on my timeline, which I believe is our ground modem Ramona. I believe that's her cousin, Mr. who's just acknowledged that. Okay, so we've got my link up now, and at least it provides the picture, the thumbnail, provides the thumbnail, which Pavel's own did not. And so this will also provide a thumbnail. So let's get this published. And so you people hear me saying this stuff, and it's just waiting for everybody to gather while we kind of go through all the motions of going through weather impacted. Well, what do we call it? We were taken offline by the weather. There was a blackout in my executive producer's home, and so our man Pavel has got us back online, and we're just regathering everyone. And now I'm back with my head and my arms on the table, on the desk rest, as we used to call it in school. I think we called it that. And now people can come back to us again. We may not get everyone we had before, but we should, actually, anyone who's paying attention. And So as I was saying, I take it we might as well get started back. What's your feeling? You can tell me either verbally or in the text box what your feeling is. Should I just start talking again at full head of steam, or give it a few more seconds here with some mumbling and some putzing and futzing?
Okay, I unmuted just to relay with right now. People have reconnected. It hasn't been going up. So I think what happened was I read a message from Ramona Halitha Henry. She says we were offline more than 5 minutes. So I think people didn't know what happened. So it might be that people just left because there was no way of letting them know what happened. So I don't know if they might actually. Yeah, okay, so I think they will find their way back. But the core people that sort of waited around to see what happens have reconnected. So I say we go ahead and continue, and I'll splice it together when I'm working on this later. Sounds good.
Beautiful, baby, beautiful. Thank you so much, brother in battle. And you're you're recording now, right?
Yeah. And yeah, yes. We are recording now. We've been on 11 minutes. Yeah, we've been recording. Okay, so it's all yours now.
Sure, that's fine. That's just more splice time. Okay, thank you. Bless you. All right, our brother in battle. I want to acknowledge as well, since it's kind of like starting new for a second time, want to acknowledge people that I neglected to acknowledge right at the beginning of the show. Our dear brother in battle and a member of Team Dietrich, as far as I'm concerned, it's Laird and Master in many regards, John Warrington, the Maggot Man. Don't forget, he has his own Maggot channel. You will find it by looking up Maggot Douglas Dietrich. But he also has his archival URL, which he has, created a sub-channel with, so that we can access my archives so much more easily. And so we owe him much for this. And I'm trying to look for that little address here. I know that he's been going through a lot with me in terms of this. Okay, here we are. tinyurl.com /showsdd. And that will take you to our archives. tinyurl.com /showsdd. And this has been integrated, as well as information about the Maggot Tour himself, into my promotional banners. I'm going to reintegrate it into the text of many of our promotional banners going back several transmissions. And I'm very happy to do that to help our Laird and Master, Mr. Jonathan Warrington, who's made keeping my legacy alive possible. And Ramona Halitha Henry says that we're lucky that the power surge didn't fry our computer. We are very lucky. She's got a post up saying, thanks, Pavel. And it's her, I think it's her cousin, Kenneth Henry Sr., who's basically put a like on it and acknowledged it. So that's cool. And aside from that, we also have a new member of Team Dietrich, Mr. George Knight. And he has a fabulous name, George, the name of my first name of my late sainted sire, the man who raised me, and Knight, spelled with a K, just like the actual knight in shining armor. And he's proven such in many ways. And so far, I haven't gotten an acknowledgement on my timeline from many of the people who have probably found their ways back. Mike Sherrill, of course, is trying to help us out, saying he's looked into Discord. You know, all our thanks to Mike Sherrill. And I know that he's saying it's worth a shot, you know, because Skype is crapped out with him too. And so, you know, I understand this. And the it was actually not Skype. In this case, it was actually about the fact that the power went out in my executive producer's home. So that's really what took us out. We had a rolling blackout going on in his area of Canada. And so that explains that. So what I was saying was I was talking about the biblical perversions that have led to massacres of synagogues by white trash pieces of shit like the synagogue shooter who was cared for by Jewish doctors. And I, of course, was saying how I never would have had that capacity for humanity for a person who killed people whom I identified with or whom I would be identified with. Even if I didn't identify with them, I would be identified as such by such an individual if I were Jewish. And this is the kind of individual who Jewish doctors were treating in the city of Pittsburgh, I believe it was. That it's just monstrous. And these men were and women were saints, treating for this individual who had used biblical rationalizations as promoted by evangelicals and the monstrous predators, who are all united together now in a united white identity front, a white supremacy front, on places like Bell Gap, which has replaced BellGab.com. They've replaced it with BellGap.com as the new gathering point for the pedo-holics. And that is, of course, where this individual, the scumbag who shot up the synagogue on Squirrel Hill that Saturday of October last year in my birth menses, my birth month, that is a situation which shows how toxic Christianity has basically resulted in massacre, and therefore interpretation of the Bible is more important than ever. And so when we are confronted with this reality, and the reality of toxic Christianity, then of course we are basically realizing that we are at war, and the enemy is trying to masquerade as if they are Christians, and they are not. So now that we've exposed so-called sheep to be monsters, let's talk about a monster who has a bizarrely and perversely, I will admit, special place in my own affections or heart. The character that comes up on Halloween through a series of franchised films by that title. And of course, one of the reasons I am bringing this up is it's perfectly in context with the thematic of everything I've been saying about atheism, toxic Christianity, true Christianity, theology, and the concept of human life and the value of human life. There is a method to my madness when I reference this. So when I think of the Halloween franchise, one of the people who perverted it or hijacked it was John Carpenter, who was responsible, of course, for making it great in the sense of the soundtrack. So with John Carpenter and the Halloween soundtrack, we have identified John Carpenter over the years because the man who created the Halloween franchise is dead and cannot protest it. Basically, John Carpenter has exploited that opportunity, has moved in, and people generally identify him as the creator of Halloween. Okay, this is not the case. So to give you a little backstory here of why Halloween has a special place in my heart, why it has actually some meaning, what we've got in the case of Michael Myers, his creator, is not at all John Carpenter. It is a Muslim individual named Mustafa Akkad. And Mustafa Akkad is almost totally unknown to the white American world today. He is someone who is a creator of a franchise that created the entire Mad Slasher phenomenon that has led to everyone else that now becomes included in a kind of category with Michael Myers, whether it's Freddy Krueger, whether it's a person like Jason from the Friday the 13th franchise, which is centered on Crystal Lake, which is an actual geographic location in California. The only person to actually predate Michael Myers is the historical Leatherface and the cinematic Leatherface, on which is based off the historical Leatherface, Ed Gein. which, of course, is the inspiration as a historical psychotic for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. And in terms of the Leatherface phenomena, that's a different thing I don't need to go into. But with Michael Myers, the creator, Mustafa Akkad, was a Muslim who had issues with his faith and with practitioners of his faith in the same way that I myself, as a true Christian, have, of course, issues with the perversion of Christianity by despoilers such as the white evangelical movement. And so when I confront that, I do so in the same spirit as Mustafa Akkad did when he tried to make the world aware of the negative aspects of Islam as perverted by fundamentalists, the fanatics who are stepping on the mic in terms of bicameral mindedness, doing all the talking, and essentially going forth to satisfy their own lustful urges for violence or vengeance and anything else they care to rationalize in the name of the Quran and Allah, the God. And Mustafa Akkad wrote a long screenplay on an honor murder, an honor killing, in which a brother murders his sister because he merely suspects that she's despoiled herself, besmirched herself in the name of the family by having sex with someone out of wedlock. And this is a screenplay that could never sell in the Muslim world. So Mustafa Akkad wound up changing and mutating the screenplay to sell it in the United States. And bigger than shit, he wound up selling it, much to his surprise, as a murder thriller. And the child, of course, is not going to be some Muslim practitioner of Southwest Asian or any other ethnicity. To sell it in America, the big market, he had to, of course, rewrite the child as white. So if you see the original Halloween as screenplay written by Mustafa Akkad, who was also the producer, he was the producer of Halloween, he basically portrays Michael Myers as this young white boy who obviously has intense incestuous desire for his sister or some other issue, and winds up becoming inflamed with outrage when he sees her enter a room or an adjacent, like the garage, the boathouse, whatever it is. She enters some other room that's not directly adjacent to the home. It's not directly connected with a boy, a friend, possibly a boyfriend, maybe just a boy who's a friend. And there is no time for them to be engaging in sexual relations. Whatever they're doing or whatever motivated them to enter this other building on the Myers property. In the film itself, if we're to follow it in real time, if we're to interpret that there be no artificial cinematic time lapse, and there's no reason for us to believe there be any, there is absolutely no time for his sister and this young lad to be engaging in anything before Michael Myers grabs a knife, puts on a William Shatner mask turned inside out, and basically makes a beeline towards that building on the Myers property, that other adjacent structure, to kill them, to kill his sister and the other boy. So this is an honor murder in the most classic, irrational, psychotic sense. He feels somehow his family's been besmirched. He's we can project those motivations onto him. Of course, he doesn't speak, so we don't get that from the character directly. But knowing the writer, Mustafa Akkad, and his original script, his original screenplay, we can simply take from what he intended and Americanize it. And basically what we have is an American Muslim in the most negative sense, taking like the aspects of perversion of Islam, of just as we see the toxic Christians pervert Christianity so there be no charity left, and they sever families and sunder lives. So too, we see this manifest in Michael Myers. And the film became, thanks to everything involved, all the parts together, Moustapha Akkad's screenplay, and the uniqueness of the concept of the American mind at the time, or rather its appeal to a fundamentalist streak of toxic Christianity, of toxic puritanical Christianity in America that so mirrors everything negative they see in Islam, that they're totally on one of, and all Americans who watched it had absolutely no conscious connection of the screenplay with what they were seeing on the screen. The Americans went for it and just ate that shit up and demanded more. And after that, every other mad slasher flick came based on the serial honor killer of Michael Matthews as a phenomena. Michael Myers. Michael Matthews was a friend of mine, actually. Guy I knew. Actually, he was gay. And became a dean of financial aid over at the California College of Podiatric Medicine, and then became a financial aid counselor at UC Berkeley. Poor bastard. So don't mean to misname him as the serial killer here. But Michael Myers, the screen character, he became the prototype, the template for everybody else after. And you've got kind of a separate from him whatever happened with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which I didn't have the equal amount of interest in because there wasn't this international phenomena behind it that created the that franchise. But in terms of Michael Myers, he started it all because with Leatherface, he was just too brutal. It was just too backwoods. It was just not something that people could identify with in that transition zone between the city and the countryside that the suburbs provided for Michael Myers. So when Michael Myers went and did what he did, and he found out he liked what he did just so much he just couldn't stop, then you had the guy who started it all. And so Michael Myers is, because he doesn't talk, he of course gets perverted by other writers who took over the franchise because Moustapha Akkad wasn't alive to continue dedicating his energies to the franchise. He did become involved, I believe, with no choice of his own, with Halloween #2. And after that, he was no longer alive to participate in any of them. The money he had amassed from the Halloween success, the original release, he tried to use to help Americans understand Islam and Arabic culture from a more positive and just relatable perspective. He directed a film entitled The Wind and the Lion, or produced it, like he had produced Halloween. And with The Wind and the Lion, he went all out and he hired megastars like Sean Connery to portray an Arab Bedouin, Tuareg tribal warrior resisting European colonialism and American imperialism. And that movie, of course, crashed and burned. So no one went to see The Wind and the Lion, which would have been the film that Moustapha Akkad wanted to be known for. Everybody went to see Michael Myers go on an honor-killing spree again and again, as rewrit multiple times. The last thing on earth Moustapha Akkad would want to have been identified with. And the end result was you had this birth of a franchise, which then a pseudo-criminal named John Carpenter took advantage of the death of Moustapha Akkad to basically hijack and claim as his own. There's no denying he produced the music, which is part of what makes Michael Myers. That's part of the signature, the brand, the logo. That's part of the magic. But he did not write that screenplay. He did not do everything to make that film possible that Moustapha Akkad did. Now, to compound the tragedy, the travesty and the irony of the life of Moustapha Akkad, you've got this Lebanese individual who winds up dying along with his daughter at the daughter's wedding because of a married pair of suicide bombers, if you can believe this. A group of fanatical Muslims, the kind who experience that horrible perversion of bicamerality where they're doing all the talking and cannot ever hear Allah speak. They decided that Moustapha Akkad had done Islam a great disservice by providing the West an example of what honor killing was all about, having no comprehension that in the West, the Americans were so fucking ignorant. They had no idea that's what Halloween was all about. and appreciated the film from a totally different perspective that was non-theological. This network of lunatics also felt that his attempts to cater to the West by popularizing Islam in the most peaceful sense via films like The Wind and the Lion, that this wasn't doing Islam justice, that it should be spread at the tip of a scimitar. They assigned a married couple, a man and a wife with suicide bomb vests, to invade the wedding of the daughter of Moustapha Akkad, at which he was attendant and physically present. The woman pulled her string first, the cord. Her vest did not explode. It was a dud. The man pushed her to the ground, and one wonders what went through that man's mind at that time. Is this an act of chivalry to push her aside, take her place with a suicide bomb? Is an act of contempt? How can you even fathom the reasoning of a couple such as that when you're dealing with this level of madness? He pulled the cord and his suicide vest worked. His bomb exploded and it took out pretty much everybody at the wedding. Moustapha Akkad and his daughter. So the Arab Muslim, the Levantine, the Lebanese man, who wrote of an honor killing that became the basis for all mad slasher films from that point forward, the template, the inspiration, died in a terrorist suicide bombing that took he and his daughter out at his daughter's wedding, based on the fact that many Muslims felt he had insulted Islam by somehow exposing the worst, seediest, darkest underbelly of their culture through a franchise that no American even ever consciously or unconsciously or in any way, shape, or form connected to Islam. And the popular film that he had made to try and have Americans understand Arabic culture in the sense of the honorable warrior of independence flopped completely in cinemas. His life is it's exemplary of tragedy. And so I have a special place in my heart for his creation. And his creation, the young man with the inside-out mask of William Shatner, of Captain Kirk. Here you have him in his one-piece overalls, his laborer's uniform, kind of like the example of the working man, the blue-collar man, going around on a killing spree that's essentially never stopped. And so when they rebooted the Michael Myers franchise 4 decades after he first terrorized audiences, he proved that he still had the goods as a fictitious character. And so the latest installment in the franchise, which was a massive success with both critics and at the box office, earning nearly 80 million United States dollars its opening weekend and earning an 80% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, It was celebrated as a return to form for the Halloween series, taking the focus off of confusing family trees and ancient witchcraft. And instead, Halloween brought the focus back to what audiences crave, which is Michael Myers' insatiable, borderline inhuman lust for ending human life. Now, with plenty of other on-screen killers racking up high body counts, I still don't think there's anybody who does it with the sincere intensity of Michael Myers. He doesn't crack jokes. He isn't teaching some grand life lesson. And here I'm alluding to both Freddy Krueger and, of course, the character from that horrible series of that franchise known as Saw. And he also doesn't have some tragic backstory that explains why he's the way he is, as with Jason of Friday the 13th. He seems to have been born pure evil and finds pleasure only in the destruction of others, ideally in a way that's equally terrifying and savage. And so there is a whole lot of murder in his latest incarnation. But it wasn't just your standard slasher killing spree, because Halloween was intent on reminding viewers of the brutality that separates Myers from his peers. So there's one scene in which Myers lets a future victim know of his malicious intent by dropping the teeth of a previous victim on the floor of the bathroom stall she's sitting in. There's another where he snaps the neck of a preteen boy shortly, who we had spent just enough time with to humanize, making his death a very chilling reminder that there's no line Myers won't cross once he's begun on a murderous rampage, except for one. Because while Michael Myers is unquestionably a monster in his latest incarnation, the film which came out last year, there's one brief moment that undermines the entirely evil characterization that he earns himself. And that moment occurs after Myers has returned to the suburbs of Haddonfield, Illinois, and is quickly racking up a body count that puts his previous efforts to shame. And at one point, Myers ends up in a random house and immediately disposes of the woman who lives there. But the woman isn't the only person in the house. And as Myers is slaughtering his latest victim, the faint cry of a baby can be heard in the background. And this immediately has its intended effect and puts the audience on edge as we follow Myers around the house. We can hear him getting closer to the infant. And perhaps the tensest moment of the entire film, Myers finally reaches the crib. And of course, the unthinkable thought enters all our minds that Michael Myers is going to slaughter an infant. And after pausing for a split second, Myers leaves the baby unharmed, other than the obvious damage of having murdered the child's mother, and heads back out to slice and dice a few more unsuspecting suburbanites on his way to exact revenge against Laurie Strode. Now, this literally momentary interaction between Michael Myers and the crying baby has no bearing whatsoever on the actual plot, and yet it is probably Halloween as a franchise, probably its most revealing glimpse into the mind of this vicious serial killer, while the rest of the movie works tirelessly to convince us that Myers is an unrepentant monster. His decision not to kill a defenseless crying baby shows that he may actually have a shred of humanity left within him. That even Myers, who is meant to represent evil personified, knows that killing a baby is simply too dark and decides to stick to murdering adults instead. Now, realistically, of course, having Myers stab the infant, even off screen, would have been too dark for many viewers. In fact, when asked about Myers' decision not to commit infanticide, the latest Halloween co-writer and director, David Gordon Green, has stated flat out, quite openly, it's the one ethical choice Myers makes. But why have him make that choice at all? The existence of the baby did nothing for the plot, and arguably, among the hardcore addicts, the gore fans, undermines the entire character of Michael Myers. Or perhaps Halloween is suggesting that while Myers may be the most deranged and vile villain in cinematic history, he still has potential for redemption. That perhaps even the evilest among us can have an intrinsic understanding of right and wrong that makes them recognize that killing a defenseless baby is simply too far. Now, none of this excuses the multiple homicides committed by Myers throughout the film, but it is the one moment that suggests he is not, in fact, pure evil, who will kill literally anyone who crosses him. When you're witnessing Myers devastate an entire town with his methodical approach to murder, it forces one to take a moment to appreciate the fact that even one of the most iconic movie murderers knows that baby murder is a line you simply don't cross. So when Halloween director David Gordon Green tried to add some details to this choice in the field, he was interviewed, at least in the interview I was able to see, with Collider, a representative of that circular. I think it's an e-zine like everything else these days. He first joked that Michael doesn't kill the infant because that would be so rude, before stating, I think it was a consideration when Michael pauses. And then he discussed the origin of the moment, which was a last-minute scramble when an actor didn't turn up. So that's terrifying in its own right if you have any involvement with the industry. You get a last-minute idea. I mean, why is there a baby crib in the living room? It was going to be her husband sleeping on the couch, but then hubby didn't show up, and they scrambled, and they put a baby crib in there. And then they just thought it would be interesting to see one ethical choice made in the film, and they flew with it. So Michael pausing by the crib makes for one of the most chilling moments in that cinematic franchise history, precisely because of what could happen. But while Michael Myers might be a monster, it would have been no longer horror, but just plain revulsion to depict him as a baby killer too. So since he's referred to as well as simply the Shape, he's called that not because he's shapeless, because we obviously have the mask, we obviously have the character, we have the outline, the physical form. He's called the Shape because his motives are entirely unknown. And while the director admitted that he had Michael Myers pause to intimate, to suggest that he likely considered the option, the fact that he made the ethical choice adds another layer of mystery to his actions that makes him far more frightening than if he were simply some mad beast. So, of course, it's also important to remember that the latest reboot dismisses everything other than the original from the entire franchise. So, if you feel I'm psychoanalyzing The Shape too much, because The Curse of Michael Myers featured him chasing after his infant nephew, then remember, that doesn't exist in the timeline of the reboot. So the way that I see Michael Myers, the way that I feel Michael Myers, is that developmentally speaking, Michael Myers is still a 6-year-old child. And the way I perceive Michael Myers is that night when he stabbed his sister to death, he ceased developing emotionally. And for this reason, I perceive Michael Myers to see children as his peers. The fact that he only murders on Halloween, a holiday most celebrated by children, is manifest of his deranged sense of playfulness. He has a mysterious hatred towards teenagers, especially women who remind him of his sister. So an old school psychiatrist would, of course, argue he had a sexual attraction to his own sister, and her perceived promiscuity made him angry. So that doesn't, of course, in any way, shape, or form, contrast with my more personal interpretation. Now, you might ask why I'm bringing this up in light of course, everything I've said about toxic Christianity, about the very fact that we're dealing with white identity, so much else that has gone on in terms of what I've articulated tonight. And of course, it brings us back to the abortion laws in New York brought to my attention by the Grand Madam Ramona Halitha Henry, and how they've changed with the Reproductive Health Act. What we've had is a long-stalled effort to strengthen abortion rights in New York that became reality yesterday evening when the legislature easily approved the measure after Republicans had stymied it for years. Governor Andrew Cuomo immediately signed the Reproductive Health Act into law after Democrats had pushed its passage for years. And the vote Tuesday came on the anniversary of the Roe versus Wade court case in 1973. The Senate passed the measure 38-24, while the Assembly passed it 92-47. So, Senate Majority Leader Andrea Stewart Cousins, Democrat from Yonkers, said, "We're saying here in New York that women's health matters. We're saying here in New York that women's lives matter. We're saying here in New York that women's decisions matter." Now, all of this, of course, is in its own way a backlash or a reaction to what Trump was doing, along with the evangelicals, to try and suppress much about abortion's rights. So this is all political. This is all part of this back and forth. And when it comes to exactly how I interpret it, the best that we can start with is just the sheer basics of the abortion bill itself and everything surrounding it within as brief a condensation as possible, a debriefing. Because in addition to the abortion bill, the Democratic-controlled legislature was set late Tuesday to pass the Comprehensive Contraception Coverage Act, which will require insurers to cover contraception for patients. So lawmakers were also expected to pass the BOSS bill, which would ban employers from discriminating against employees over their reproductive health care decisions. And what I can tell you is that abortion laws in New York have now changed upon Cuomo's signature. They've stripped abortion from the penal code. New York has legalized abortion 3 years. They had done so anyway prior to the landmark Roe versus Wade case 3 years beforehand. But New York still kept it in its criminal code, making it a felony to perform late-term abortions. So that's been stripped. The 1970 law defined homicide as conduct which causes the death of a person or an unborn child with which a female has been pregnant for more than 24 weeks. The Reproductive Health Act, stripping abortion from the penal code, added the following language, which I will read. The legislature finds that comprehensive reproductive health care is a fundamental component of every individual's health, privacy, and equality. Therefore, it is the policy of the state that every individual has the fundamental right to choose or refuse contraception or sterilization. Every individual who becomes pregnant has the fundamental right to choose to carry the pregnancy to term, to give the birth to a child, or to have an abortion pursuant to this article. Now, Cuomo wants to go even further, saying earlier this month that abortion rights should be added to the state constitution. So at his bill signing Tuesday night, Cuomo was joined by Sarah Weddington, who argued the Roe versus Wade case in front of the Supreme Court, who had done so at that time, what seems like an eternity ago at this point. So that brings us to the concept of late-term abortions. The new law will allow a licensed healthcare practitioner acting under their scope of practice to perform an abortion when, according to the practitioner's reasonable and good faith professional judgment, based on the facts of the patient's case, the patient is within 24 weeks from the commencement of pregnancy, or there be an absence of fetal viability, or the abortion is necessary to protect the patient's life or health. So the measure will make late-term abortions legal at the discretion of a healthcare practitioner based on the viability of the fetus, or if the woman's life or health be in jeopardy. Now, by the way, in my judgment, that's perfectly legitimate. That's morally fine. I can live with that morally. That's not, neither of those is morally, as far as I'm concerned, arguable. And the act will codify Roe versus Wade protections into state law if the case were to be overturned by the Supreme Court, which Cuomo cited as the main reason for needing the new state law. So what we have, of course, is the Kavanaugh Pact, the Trump Pact, Kavanaugh Court, being the main factor for rushing this through. That's important that Trump caused this. So Cuomo, at his bill signing, confirmed what I'm saying. That's why we had to pass this law to protect our state. And that's why I believe we have to go even a step further and do a constitutional amendment. Because prior state law only allowed physicians to perform abortions. So Andrea Miller, the president of the National Institute for Reproductive Health, said the act is critical to protecting the abortion rights of the New Yorkers. She said New Yorkers deserve to have safe and secure access to abortion care so they can make their own decisions about their reproductive lives. And of course, there are concerns that are also legitimately being raised by the opposition. The New Yorker for Constitutional Freedoms, which is a conservative group based in Spencerport, Monroe County, has opposed the bill, and so too have Senate Republicans. And that's why the measure has so long languished in the Republican-controlled Senate, as it passed repeatedly in the Democratic-led Assembly. But now with Democrats in control of both houses of the legislature, the Reproductive Health Act was easily passed, and Republicans railed against the bill yesterday. The New Yorkers for Constitutional Freedoms contended the act would repeal legal protections for a fetus after 20 weeks, bringing up that they believe it's that the right of every born-alive infant to receive medical care is an issue that all political parties and all sides of the abortion debate should be able to agree upon. They also said that by repealing abortions from the criminal code, it would limit prosecutors from applying criminal charges in the cases of so-called forced abortions, which can occur during domestic violence cases when a woman loses a child during pregnancy. So that, too, I obviously would stand against. That's obviously criminal in and of itself, to allow a criminal to force an abortion on a woman by beating her till she aborts. So then we come to the criminal cases. Republicans stressed that very concern yesterday, holding a news conference at the Capitol with LIVESTREAM, an Army veteran from the Bronx who lost her baby in a domestic violence attack last year. Her surname spelled Abreu. And that's where Senator Kathy Young, Republican from Olean, Cattaraugus County, said it's unconscionable to think that anyone would deprive a pregnant domestic violence victim the justice she deserves. But Democrats say there's plenty of criminal charges that could be brought against suspects in domestic violence cases involving pregnant women. So Senator Liz Kroiger, the Democrat from Manhattan, said, you have to question why would anybody actually use the abortion code to charge somebody with a heinous crime. We in the state of New York have many strict rules in our criminal code to deal with these kind of criminals. So that's understandable. And another concern is letting abortions be conducted by healthcare professionals other than physicians, with a group saying we believe it would place women's health in jeopardy to allow non-physicians to perform abortions. But Democrats said that they're confident the new law won't be abused. Stuart Cousin said that by no means do we think that decisions around these very important life issues are to be taken lightly. We just understand who needs to be taking them, and we need to get out of the way and let people make those choices. So what happened yesterday is not particularly catastrophic. It's not particularly something that has myself in any sense of alarm. What does, of course, is the phenomena of abortion itself, which, despite the fact that there have been less abortions over the past several years, does not lessen the catastrophe as it has impacted the United States of America and, of course, world civilization. So when you have Twitter users who have recently projected the fact that 60 million abortions have been performed in the United States since the Supreme Court decided Roe versus Wade, that's not a claim. This isn't like people who are pro-lifers, who are simply being melodramatic. It is very, very true. There have been well over 60 million abortions since the case was decided in 1973. So when Justice Anthony Kennedy announced that he would retire from the Supreme Court, opening the door for President Donald Trump to nominate a more rabidly reactionary jurist to the bench, the retirement of Kennedy, who is oft described as a swing vote between the 4 more conservative and 4 more liberal justices, excited pro-life reactionaries who have long hoped that Roe versus Wade, that very 1973 ruling that legalized abortion nationally, would be overturned. Now, Trump had said during a presidential debate in 2016 that he'd put pro-life judges on the court and acknowledged that time last year that abortion assets could very well end up with states at some point. So the announcement by Kennedy of his retirement led many Twitter users to bring up the 60 million abortions number that have been performed since 1973. And believe me, this is undercounted. Of course, using this fact to say it's time to send Roe versus Wade to the ash heap of history, where it belongs. We can't allow another 45 years of brutal bloodshed that has killed over 60 million of our children. Now, this is per a tweet from Live Action, a pro-life nonprofit. And then, of course, you had Denny Burke, an associate pastor at Kenwood Baptist Church, who said Roe's been settled law for a long time. Well, I think it just got unsettled. Keep in mind that Roe has caused the death of over 60 million innocent human beings since 1973. It has to end. And then you had Matthew Schmitz, a columnist at the Catholic Herald, who said 60 million Americans aborted since Roe versus Wade. We should be absolutely clear about the justice and necessity of ending the slaughter. Now, the number itself likely comes most, shall I say, factually, from the National Right to Life Committee, the NRLC, which is a pro-life advocacy group. That organization published a report in January of 2018, yesteryear, that estimates that 60.1 million abortions have been performed in the United States since 1973, and the NRLC relies on data from the Guttmacher Institute, which is a pro-choice organization that produces some of the most reliable and complete estimates on the number of abortions performed over the years, by surveying clinics, hospitals, and other facilities that offer abortion services. Researchers at the Guttmacher Institute estimated that 55.5 million abortions were performed in the United States from 1973 to 2014, the latest year for which data was available. And the NRLC calculates a figure through 2017 by assuming that the same number of abortions performed in 2014, which was 926,200, were performed the following years as well. The organization then adjusts the total number of abortions upward by 3% to account for underreporting. And researchers at Guttmacher acknowledge that their figures actually undercount the true number of abortions by at least 5%. Because you have an estimated 2,000 physicians who perform abortions in their private practice that never turn in data. They are entirely missing from the calculations. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, publishes abortion estimates of its own. But that data has much larger gaps. For one, the agency has lacked consistent data from California, my own state, and New Hampshire in particular, since 1998. And these states performed 17% of all abortions. Certainly did so in 2014. And another deficiency is the way the data be reported. The CDC relies on voluntary submissions from central health agencies that are consistently and intentionally entirely incomplete. Guttmacher, on the other hand, takes a more proactive approach to data collection. So for its latest report, researchers made 11,800 contacts to follow up with non-responsive abortion facilities. And the disparity can be seen in the number of abortions reported over time by Guttmacher versus the CDC. So abortions have declined almost every year since 1990, due in part to the greater access to contraception, including longer-term birth control options like IUDs, intrauterine devices. And the decline has occurred despite a growing population in the United States. In fact, there be proportionately fewer abortions being performed today than when Roe versus Wade was decided. Abortions per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44 fell from 16.3 in 1973 to 14.6 in 2014, according to the Guttmacher Institute. About 39% of the women who had abortions in 2014 were white, 28% were black, and 25% were Hispanic. Proportionately speaking, there were 10 abortions per 1,000 white women, 27.1 abortions per 1,000 black women, and 18.1 per 1,000 Hispanic women. Nearly half of all abortions were for women whose family incomes were below 100% of the federal poverty line. But I've always looked at abortion from a far more inhuman perspective, the economic perspective. So, on January of 2017, the year before yesteryear, the week following the women's marches, was really busy. Monday that week, Donald Trump signed a ban on federal money going to international groups that perform or provide information on abortions. And on Tuesday that week, the United States House of Representatives voted to prevent terminations being covered by medical insurance funded by the American taxpayer. The first was the reinstatement of the Mexico City policy, or global gag rule, which stopped non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, outside of the United States who offered or even advised on abortions from receiving any money at all from the United States government. NGOs would no longer be even able to tell a woman that abortion is legal in her country without losing all U.S. federal aid. The second maneuver was a no taxpayer funding for Abortion and Abortion Insurance Full Disclosure Act, which prevented women from paying for abortions with their insurance if it was or is state-funded through Medicaid or state-subsidized through Obamacare. This, of course, affects lower-income women the most, as these be the cheapest forms of health insurance. So abortion be a divisive topic, to say the least, and many people already have strong set opinions on it, though not Trump, who has changed his mind depending on his audience. But whatever your moral position, it's worth looking at the effects of women being able to access abortions on a country's economy. One of the biggest effects of legalizing abortion is that fertility levels go down. Since legalization, the overall birth rate fell by 5% in the United States, directly because of legislation. And within certain demographics, teenagers and African Americans, the rate fell by even more, up to 12%. Although lots of abortions still go on, whether or not they're legal, there are many women who would have a legal abortion but wouldn't risk a backstreet abortion or pay for going abroad. It's worth noting that the population of the United States is still growing at roughly the same pace as before Roe versus Wade, by a couple of million every year, as immigration has counterbalanced the decline in fertility. So abortion legalization also changes the kind of children who are born. Fewer children are raised in single-parent families, fewer children grow up on benefits, and fewer children grow up in poverty. The Roe versus Wade generation was more likely to graduate from college, make their own living without needing welfare, and raise their children alongside a partner. Crime rates fell dramatically around 20 years after abortion was legalized, with many hypothesizing that higher levels of abortion led to lower levels of criminality. So we know that abortions lower the domestic birth rate and raise average life prospects for the children who are born. But they also lift a burden off the taxpayer. After the Hyde Amendment in the United States, a law that restricted federal funds going towards abortions except in the cases of incest, rape, or when the woman's life be in danger, researchers found that the discounted future public cost to be almost 100 times the cost of an abortion might be contested that in their presentation of facts as they understood them, probably sincerely, for every public dollar spent to pay for abortions for poor women, more than $4 is saved in medical and social welfare costs over the next 2 years, was the statistics that they were rationalizing their stance upon. And of course, these are U.S. statistics. But the general idea be clear that they're promoting, that if taxpayers resent paying for abortions, they should be aware of that further down the line, they'll end up paying far more, per this logic, to fund schools, welfare, etc. All other things staying constant, making abortions harder to access and more expensive, by this logic, would only make the world a poorer, more crime-ridden, and welfare-dependent place. So when Trump came in and the global gag rule was reinstated, it was calculated that it would be responsible for 6.5 million unintended pregnancies, 2.2 million abortions, 2.1 million unsafe abortions, and 21,700 maternal deaths by 2020, mothers dying in childbirth, if the loss of aid was not met by other sources. And it was assumed that that's exactly what Trump was after, because Trump has said that women seeking abortions should face some form of punishment. But you might have hoped, of course, he would have prioritized the economy over vindictiveness and politics. Of course, if we go along this line, that would be along the logic that the economic impact of denying abortion care might be bigger than one would at first assume. That women who are denied an abortion are 3 times more likely to be unemployed than women who are able to access one. Because women are already struggling financially when they seek abortion care, as it's called. Half of those in a study that I reviewed had incomes below the federal poverty level, and 3/4 reported not having enough money to pay for basic living expenses. So that same researcher Diana Green Foster embarked on this landmark study comparing the lives of women who got an abortion with those who were turned away and forced to carry to term. When she heard a woman who ran an abortion clinic wonder what happened to those turned away. So the latest findings of ANSWER, that's an acronym, ANSIRH, all caps, an acronym for Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health, they financed a longitudinal turnaway study, which recruited participants from 30 abortion facilities across the United States for nearly 8,000 interviews between 2008 and 2015, that indicated that limiting women's access to abortion increases their chances of poverty, unemployment, and dependence on public assistance programs. And that research was published, I think it was just last month. Maybe last year at this point is a better way of saying it, in the American Journal of Public Health, that found that those denied abortion access because they were too far along in pregnancy were nearly 4 times as likely to be below the federal poverty level compared to those who received care. So there's class economic issues here that are obviously prejudiced against the needy. Take the case of one 19-year-old woman with a 9-month-old son who was turned away from a Midwestern clinic. She was working full-time as a housekeeper but wanted to go to school to become a registered nurse, according to this case study shared by Diana Green Foster, who was responsible for the administration of this landmark research work. And so Foster herself, by the way, is a professor and director of research at ANSWER, the Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health. And that itself, again, so people understand what that facility, that network is, it's a collaborative research group at the University of California, San Francisco, at UCSF, which is why I myself am familiar with it, because, of course, I studied for over a decade at UCSF. At the time, I was advocating for my parents as senior care recipients. And in order to become a better advocate and a better care provider, I attended what was called the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, which is, of course, a medical journalism course is the best way to describe it, where we had many lecturers, many of them Nobel Prize laureates, or people who were nominated for the Nobel Prize, who lectured on any number of subjects that are medical and relevant to the human experience via the medical industrial complex. So this unnamed woman, who's just used as an example by Professor Foster at UCSF, when she was first interviewed, she was receiving public assistance through TANF, an acronym, TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, here in San Francisco, and SNAP, the federal program of Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, the food stamps, as people know. It's a plastic card, like a debit card. Of course, that's reached its endpoint with the federal shutdown. But there was also assistance for her from WIC, W-I-C, the Women, Infants, and Children, and Medicaid. She had been receiving treatment for depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder that she asserted stemmed from being molested and abused in her youth. None of this is hard to believe. She said she didn't want to continue her pregnancy because she couldn't afford it. In a year, she expected her life would be harder with a baby as she tried to go to school. Now, 3 weeks after her son was born, she was 20 and living with her boyfriend and 2 children in a duplex. She had a monthly household income of $900 that she said met her basic living needs most of the time. She wasn't working and was attending technical school full-time, but wasn't sure when she would graduate. She was not being treated for any of her mental health conditions, though she had thoughts of ending her life and said her problems made it very difficult for her to live normally. She no longer wished she could have had an abortion, but she said she felt disappointed about both becoming pregnant and being turned away from the clinic. So she was interviewed again a year later, and by then she had begun working full-time after finding daycare, but she was homeless with her 2 children, had 0 income the previous month. had not received the $1,000 in child support for which she was eligible. She didn't have health insurance of any sort, had been to the doctor just once in the past 6 months for a birth control shot. Her story is just one example of how those turned away after seeking abortion care can become further trapped in poverty. Being denied a wanted abortion has led some women and their families to become even more financially insecure. So Foster has taken the stance that if you ask women why they want an abortion, the most common reasons have to do with finances. They feel they can't afford to have a child, and it's in the economic outcomes that we see the biggest difference between a woman who has received and a woman who was denied an abortion. So Foster's report indicates that many women were already struggling financially when they sought abortion care. Half had incomes below the federal poverty level, and 3/4 reported not having enough money to cover basic living expenses. 6 months after being denied an abortion, women were 3 times more likely to be unemployed than women who were able to access abortion care. They were also more likely to be enrolled in welfare programs. So these studies' findings match what women seeking abortion say they fear, that the denial of abortion care leads to further economic insecurity. And prior to this study, there was little comparative research on abortion that went beyond looking at women's mental health or drug and alcohol use. Comparisons of women who had abortions to women who did not seek one and chose to continue a pregnancy were inherently biased, or so has been noted by the people who performed this study that I'm sourcing. So the study comes as access to abortion care faces increasing hurdles in these United States because of Donald Trump and his born-again evangelical advisors advising him to shut down on accessibility. So the study, according to women or specialists, it doesn't matter the gender necessarily, like Jenny Abrams, a doctor in Seattle, a fellow with Physicians for Reproductive Health, has asserted, based on this study, that this study shows that restrictive legislation really harms women and children's health, and that the people who should be making those decisions be the parents, the woman specifically, because restricting someone's capacity to move up or out of poverty is a huge implication. Especially when the white supremacist evangelicals refuse to help the poor, especially poor minorities, based on their perversion of the Bible. So the findings are not at all surprising to many who have been advocating pro-choice women's rights for years. They mirror what many people like Jenny Abrams see in their own practice as family medicine doctors and abortion providers. They often see women who already have large families who feel they just can't take care of one more child. And they also see many low-income families with lots of children, and they see the strain it puts on their parents to work multiple jobs and do everything they can to stay afloat. So given the inflammatory rhetoric around abortion in politics and the bills being pushed denying people abortion access by individuals such as this, they feel it's notable how there be a lot of talk of fetuses, but that women are always entirely absent from the conversation. If you only think of abortion as a political issue, then you can forget that there be real women making decisions about their real lives, that they be balancing a lot of lives, the children they already have and the children they want to have. But the reality that I see from a purely economic perspective is that there be more economic costs to be incurred from abortion than benefits. Abortion costs us, the United States, 9 trillion United States dollars. And I can tell you why. But first, we have to ask, how much is a human life worth? Now, such a question almost seems absurd, even immoral. Every life is priceless. Well, there's people who need to die. That's a different thing entirely. But when we take a look at children's books like Horton Hears a Who and movies like It's a Wonderful Life, both of which are insufferable wartime propaganda to myself, we are told from this wartime propaganda perspective that our lives have inherent, even immeasurable value. Indeed, those who argue that some lives are more valuable than others due to things like sex, race, creed, nationality, or disability are rightly criticized by society in general. But every day, corporations, activists, and individuals are asked to consider this very question and make life-altering decisions. In capitalism, which of course I decry as a system as degenerate as communism, and instead have always advocated the third economic path, the third dimension of fascism. But in capitalism, as we are stranded within this system today, the value is determined by how much people be willing to pay for it. Thus, the value of gold changes depending on the supply, demand, and perceived value of that commodity. Likewise, the economic value of a good can be determined by the amount a person be willing to sell the item for. If I'm not willing to part with my car for less than $10,000, then I have valued my car at more than $10,000. Such calculations of cost and value make up our daily lives. And while it be true that a human life is different than a car or gold coinage, our actions reveal the economic value we assign to our neighbors and to ourselves. So then, how much be a human life worth? For Planned Parenthood, the value of an unborn human life is approximately $500,000 United States dollars, the average cost of one of their abortions. But be that a fair and economic exchange for a baby's life? The Department of Transportation has found that, as a nation, America is willing to spend $9.1 million to save an individual life based on calculating a wide variety of variables, including the costs of preventive medicine, safety devices, average salaries, etc. That means we have decided that the economic and social contributions of an individual American be worth over $9 million United States dollars. But yet the average abortion values a child's life at $500,000. That's 0.005556% of the lifetime economic value of that child's life. In fact, Yahoo News estimates that parents spend over $6,500 United States dollars during the first year of a baby's life. Ergo, that's Latin for therefore, economic activity is generated on things like diapers, wipes, strollers, and other baby items. If there are about 1 million abortions a year, that be $6.5 billion United States dollars of lost economic activity per year, annually. Directly resulted abortion. And if the Department of Transportation's estimate about the economic value of a life be correct, then 1 million abortions costs us over 9 trillion United States dollars, yes, that's trillion with a T, in lost economic and social impact. To put this number in perspective, 9 trillion United States dollars is greater than the entire gross domestic product of the Empire of Japan and Die New Vereinigte Deutschland, the new United Germany combined. The third and fourth most prosperous economies in the world. The leaders of the free world, the combined second axis. And every year that abortion continues in America, we lose an additional 9 trillion United States dollars in lifetime economic impact. And yet, despite this mind-blowing data, major corporations like Johnson & Johnson, Adobe, Boeing, and Bath & Body Works, to name a few, operate gains their own self-interest by financially supporting the efforts of Planned Parenthood, an organization that reduces the number of customers, employees, and innovators entering the economy and creating wealth. By supporting Planned Parenthood, these corporations, especially Johnson & Johnson, a leading creator of baby-related products, display hostility to their very economic future, not just unborn life. When considering the economic benefit of a human life, it becomes clear that abortion is destroying our economy. I recognize that for a woman facing unplanned pregnancy, considering the lifetime economic impact an unborn life will have upon her is more than overwhelming. For many women, a $500 abortion sounds preferable to raising a baby in an abusive relationship, dropping out of college, raising a child as a single mother, or any of the host of other concerns pregnant women face. It's no wonder that 75% of women cite a financial concern as the reason for their abortion. Now, this is why you have organizations out there like CareNet and CareNet's affiliated pregnancy centers that offer women compassion, hope, help necessary to be able to carry their children to term and pursue their dreams. Last year alone, CareNet affiliates provided mothers and fathers with over 56 million United States dollars of free services. So the help is out there that nobody's bothering to look for. And they've been serving abortion vulnerable women and men for maybe 40 years and have found the best way to save unborn lives is by equipping clients with the resources necessary to make life-affirming decisions. And that's why 80% of their clients choose life for their unborn children. It's also why organizations that rely on abortion revenue, like Planned Parenthood, do not provide many prenatal care and parenting resources to their clients. A woman who feels she has all she needs to raise her baby is far less likely to pay $500,000 for an abortion. So supporters of pregnancy centers know that any resources they can provide to those facing pregnancy decisions to enable them to carry their children to term provide us a tremendous return on their investment, not just socially, but economically as well. The cost of raising a child is far outweighed by the economic and cultural wealth the child will generate during this lifetime of himself or herself among us. So then, what be the value of a human life? I know it be impossible to predict the value of a child's life, financially or culturally. We embrace the mystery that every blip on the fetal heartbeat monitor represents as a society. We recognize in civilized culture that each unborn child has the potential to cure cancer, become president, or otherwise make history. It be this very potentiality that causes even estimates like those of the Department of Transportation to ultimately fail. We know from experience as a species that none of these outcomes can be determined for the child by his or her parents, doctors, or even the place of his or her birth, but be dependent on choices the child will make during his or her lifetime. Choices that child deserves the right to make. Ironically, the very organizations that deny the right of these unborn lives to choose who they will become have the audacity to claim that they be the ones who be pro-choice. A human life, whether it be sheltered within its mother's womb or facing an unplanned pregnancy, is immeasurably valuable, worthy of our protection. our compassion, our hope, and our help. And that's something that no money can buy. And when I analyze the effects of abortion on the economy, going back to as heartless a Vulcan interventionist perspective as I can, the assertion that has predominated philosophy of the post-Enlightenment West, the pro-choice West, that by eliminating a population through abortion, one no longer has to spend money to feed or clothe that population, entirely and willfully ignores the fact that one thereby destroys a population that will work. Speaking less as a human being and more as the stereotypical Hollywood fascist, which of course is part of the myth perpetrated by the alliance at war with the 1,000-year Reich in exile and my own true homeland and heartland of nationalist China as reestablished on the Isles of Formosa, Taiwan. I can tell you that fascism be the true face of humanity. And as a fascist, I can assert at a loss of over 400,000 persons per year that would have otherwise become members of society. For over 40 years, in total, by now, about 15 million persons have been lost because of abortion's legalization. Hence, approximately 10 million workers have been eliminated by abortion. Of these 10 million, approximately 5 million would be of age to actively participate in the labor force today. Without legalized abortion, over 5 million additional people would be part of the current labor force. This is a substantial fraction of the present labor force of 150 million workers. Legalizing abortion causes a loss of between 70 billion and 135 billion United States dollars of economic activity, valued work, each and every year in the United States. Suppose an income tax rate of 15 to 25%, between 10 billion and 33 billion United States dollars is lost presently in annual tax revenue. This be a significantly larger loss than the less than 2 billion United States dollars of public funds some estimate abortion saves our pocketbook as taxpayers. This cost of abortion legalization does not capture the non-labor costs of legalizing abortion, like the medical costs of rising STD rates, sexually transmitted diseases. When I speak of the 10 million workers eliminated by abortion, this is based on a standard labor participation rate of 2/3, a rate that is largely valid over the last 2 decades. And when I speak of the billions of dollars of economic activity in valued work lost each year by the United States, it's assuming an average income of $14,000 to $27,000 United States dollars per aborted worker per year, times 5 million lost persons who would be working now. That provides myself in calculation 70 billion United States dollars to 135 billion United States dollars per year lost in valued economic activity, what we call work. The median United States income per worker is around 40,000 United States dollars per year. $40,000 is 150% of $27,000. So, abortion, a decrease of U.S. population, and its effect on society shows us how this much lower value, the median worker having income 50% higher than the the aborted worker, for the average aborted worker is obtained by calculated logic in which I've understated everything. I've undercalculated everything in terms of loss. And it still boggles the mind. When I speak of an income tax rate of 15 to 25%, it's based on the fact that in recent history, mandatory FICA taxes have alone been more than 15% of wages. Now, it's been so long since I've had to pay these. I remember that acronym as Federal Insurance Contributions Act. And the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, FICA, is a United States law that creates a payroll tax requiring a deduction from the paychecks of employees as well as contribution from employers to fund the Social Security and Medicare programs, federal programs that provide benefits for retirees, people with disabilities, and children of deceased workers. So, 15 to 25% tax rate represents a serious underestimate of tax revenue from these workers that would otherwise be working now had abortion not been legalized. So I'm undercalculating everything. For the lower quintiles, Brookings and the Urban Institute put average household net tax rate at something below 10%, up to something around 20% in recent history. They have a website that I consulted. It's a web resource available at www.taxpolicycenter.org/tax facts. The rough estimate above what I've just said, what I provided, can be reconciled with net historical cycles levels that I found via that source on the internet. And by noting labor participation rates being on average at about 66%. So 10% is 66% of 15%. 20% tax on 66% of workers, obviously less than an average tax of 20% on households. This analysis focuses, on my part, on the worker that would be alive. And note, moreover, that net taxes, which for the lower quintiles has lately dropped far below their historical rates, also include government transfers in them. So poverty and income distribution affect this tax calculation. The lately occurring 10% average for the lower quintiles is to be taken as reasonable. Lower bound for the tax rate that would now be levied on these workers who are not alive. So at most a 20% shift, a shift down of one quintile class, be what I see, albeit with great uncertainty, in the poverty classification of these workers. So I've avoided the analytical issue of trying to deduce savings from abortion to federal program expenses. So this is all somewhat simplified, but nevertheless, the end point, the outcome is quite clear. When I say that this is altogether a significantly larger loss than the less than $2 billion United States dollars of funded public funds that some estimate abortion saves us as a tax-paying electorate, then I'm reminded of the article from the Quarterly Journal of Economics, volume 114, number 1, circulated in 1999, pages 263 through 291. An article entitled Abortion, Legalization, and Child Living Circumstances. Who is the Marginal Child? It's written by a trio of co-authors, Jonathan Gruber, Philip Levine, and Douglas Steger. And this is a bit of an apples to oranges comparison. when you see a decrease of U.S. population and effects on society, there is a yet more serious issue in deducing such savings to poverty programs, as the growth of poverty programs has been so explosive over the last 2 to 3 decades. Over that period, the programs have grown from less than 200 billion United States dollars to well over 650 billion United States dollars, as was calculated in 2010, a decade ago. The United States population expanded by less than 30% over that time, and yet pretty much everyone went on welfare. The overwhelming majority of them, by the way, whites. So the programs have expanded far beyond covering poverty-level individuals. The programs regularly transfer money to those at 200% of the poverty threshold. And I got this from National Affairs magazine, volume number 13, published in 2012, pages 3 through 28, authored by David Armour and Sonia Souza. So the economic loss so calculated by these sources that I, of course, researched into with my background as a Department of Defense librarian and the skills I derived therefrom, that experience. The economic loss so calculated is concrete and conservative, meaning that it's really understated, based upon an empirically deduced counterfactual, how many would be alive and working now had abortion not been legalized. Savings cannot be so estimated, not because of the programs of interest showing no reasonable fiscal definability over the past decades. Program function may not be based upon a status like poverty, but on political general equilibrium or wealth transfer concerns. And that's discussed in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, published in 2003, in an article entitled "The Rise in the Disability Rolls and the Decline in Unemployment," for proof supporting this other line of reasoning. But altogether, now that I've given you the sources for my stance, the economic effect of abortion is indisputable. Billions and billions lost. And as we all know, there be so many effects that abortion has on our society and the entire world. What has always astonished me is utterly incomprehensible to me. How it's always intentionally overlooked at how abortion is destroying our economy, taking us into the abyss. People make the mistake that abortion is solely a moral issue and therefore cannot be related to the effects of the economy. This is disastrous. It's catastrophic. It is also insanity. In the United States, we have a national debt over 16 trillion United States dollars, which has surpassed our nation's annual gross domestic product. In other words, our federal government is spending beyond our means via all the programs that I've just stated that people say they're saving money on by killing kids. Since abortion was legalized in 1973 by Roe versus Wade, over 60 million babies have died. I've factored so few of them into the workforce. It's pitiful. I've been so ultra-conservative that only so many of them have gotten jobs. About 15 million in my calculations out of 50 million that have died, with over 3,000 killed on a daily basis. It's horrible enough that these innocent babies are murdered. Something Michael Myers wouldn't do. But can you imagine how many more contributions those 50 million lives would have made? Perhaps one of those aborted could have found a way to cure AIDS, cancer, or asthma, just to name a few. Yes, I know, AIDS has already been cured and they're not distributing it. I've brought this up because of the FDA, and I could go on and on. You get my point. I'm going at the recognizable brand names of these conditions that we're all familiar with, rather than saying something like, the acute flaccid myelitis, which nobody knows what the fuck that is unless they hear a Dietrich transmission. Aside from all that, in addendum, with more people contributing to society through work, we would have a far higher GDP, our gross domestic product, which would greatly help reduce the burden of our government spending, which spends about 4 billion United States dollars daily. Much progress could be made to shore up the Social Security of the 10,000 individuals we retire every day. So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Social Security Administration, Guttmacher Institute, and National Center for Health Statistics, if abortion had never been legalized in 1973, more than 17 million people would be employed. As I speak, as I burn bandwidth, they went a little above my own calculations, resulting in an additional 400 billion United States dollars from those workers, with 11 billion United States dollars contributed to Medicare and 47 million United States dollars contributed to Social Security. Although it's important to also reduce government spending, these added incomes would nevertheless more than help the American empire. It doesn't take a world-renowned economist to figure out that when you're decreasing the youth from abortion, and with all the baby boomers retiring, the people who decided to have all the abortions, Social Security is going to run out, especially if we continue with abortions and the amount of spending by the federal government. Even though Social Security cannot last forever with the amount of federal spending today, not having abortion would help Social Security last longer, assuming that the amount of federal spending be the same. In population studies, at least 2.1 kids per household are needed to maintain stable population. The average number of kids per household today is about 2.0 in this country, which isn't even meeting the replacement level of 2.1 needed to maintain the population for future generations to come. The slow growth in the United States population seen in recent years be due to immigration and people living longer. This is a problem not only in America, but also around the world, especially for many countries in Europe that have even fewer children per household. During the 1990s is when Europe found a sharp decline in birth rates, with Southern and Eastern Europe's plummeting below 1.3 kids per household. Worldwide, birth rates have decreased from 6.0 in 1972 to about 2.9 nowadays. We are globally suffering from a population crash. And China is the preeminent nation to consider, with its one-child policy only all too recently being aborted as state policy. Although it's made a big improvement in its economy from the past, it's only a matter of time before the one-child policy, brought to an abrupt abortion itself all too late in the game, has its impact on the Chinese economy, with millions of babies having been killed who would have otherwise eventually become productive citizens and contributed to Chinese gross domestic product. China is just one of many nations around the world that's looking at a decline in youth workers, as the United Nations projects the number of factory workers aged 15 to 24 to decline by 27% to 164 million through the year 2025. On the other hand, those over 65 years old will increase by 78% to 195 million during the same time period. Since China implemented its one-child policy in 1979, approximately 400 million babies have been aborted who would have eventually helped contribute to its workforce today and in the near future, a future which is now abortive. China is on the verge of extinction. China is dying. The China as we know it will no longer exist within a generation. In order to even maintain a fraction of its population, it's abducting women, literally abducting them from all over the world. All children born in China will be, as myself, hybridized. In the interim, I'm stranded here, and you're stuck with me amidst government shutdown. It's still prior midnight here on the West Coast. It's day 33 of the partial government shutdown, and some federal workers face the prospect of missing another paycheck, all because of the wall and the tower. It's been 2 years and a single day since Donald Trump took office as president of the United fucking States. It's been over 30 days, 40 at this point, since a partial government shutdown. But the man who presented himself as the ultimate deal maker is having trouble getting any deal on the reopening of the government done, in part because so few lawmakers, even in his own criminal party, will trust him. On Saturday, Trump offered 3 years of protection against deportation for about 1 million immigrants, including some dreamers, as well as refugees, in exchange for more than $5 billion United States dollars in border wall funding. That proposal didn't just flop with Democrats, but it also riled some reactionary critics who worry Trump is softening his hard line on immigration. Trump then unleashed some tweets to counter that perception, along with one accusing House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of behaving irrationally in rejecting his offer. Meanwhile, the questions over Trump's efforts to build a tower in Moscow while he was campaigning for president and claiming he had nothing to do with Russia are growing. Trump's lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani, the man who visited all the kids being raped and butchered alive at West Point in the child daycare center in building number 666. That man who said it was all cool, the kids were all doing it to themselves, sticking broken bottles up their own cunts and anuses. Because, you know, they just wanted attention, and it just feels so good to do that. That same subhuman piece of pig shit that Aquino occultist confirmed that talks about the Trump Tower project continued up to the 2016 election, months longer than acknowledged. Meanwhile, the shutdown standoff between Trump and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi could mean the president may try and deliver late his State of the Union speech somewhere other than the House. President Trump says House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is behaving irrationally in the shutdown impasse, all while more Russia questions swirl ever closer around him in this cloud. The Senate, of course, was supposed to vote on a pair of bills aimed at reopening the parts of the government that be closed. One bill, backed by the Republican Party, would fund President Trump's border wall and offer temporary protections for DACA recipients. The other bill, backed by the Democrats, is a short-term funding legislation that offers no money for the wall. Both be expected to fail if they haven't failed already. And they're still touted as, despite their failures, somehow being the first step in ending the shutdown. And that end can't come soon enough for the 800,000 federal workers impacted by Trump shutdown, the Trump down. Many federal employees are getting help from food banks during the government shutdown. Coast Guard members are relying on food pantries, which the head of the Coast Guard calls unacceptable, and I don't blame him. We got an Oregon food bank right up north from my state of California facing a 9.0 earthquake catastrophe because of the government shutdown affecting food banks around that state. The partial shutdown of the federal government is causing collateral damage because 10,000 federal employees in the state of Oregon never needed a food bank, but do so now. So Susanna Morgan, the chief dentist executrix officier of the Oregon Food Bank, said 1 in 5 of our neighbors is struggling with hunger. The government shutdown is making this worse. We've got United States airports hit by TSA absences as the partial government shutdown enters its 5th fucking week. The Transportation Security Administration reported that 10% of airport security screeners did not show up to work over the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday weekend. Many cited financial hardship as a reason. They be among the federal workers being asked to work without pay. The TSA is feeling the strain of low staffing and is asking for 250 more people as call-outs increase. FBI agents, in an anonymous report, say the shutdown is damaging counterterrorism operations and hurting national security. The Trump presidency, from the shutdown to the Russia investigation, is putting enormous pressure on the FBI. For a besieged Federal Bureau of Investigations, the shutdown is just the latest Trump-era assault. Earlier this week, FBI agents began leaving bags of canned food in a break room in the Bureau's Washington field office. The agents and other staffers, concerned about colleagues who have been working without pay during the government shutdown, left the food for those in need. No one monitored who entered and left the room. No one tracked what was taken. Employees could take what they needed without being shamed in front of colleagues. I don't know whether I'm going to laugh or cry. Tom O'Connor, the head of the FBI Agents Association, said, "It's discouraging that this is the way people who put their lives at risk are being treated by the federal government. To be treated this way is wrong." And as the longest ever United States government shutdown in recorded history enters its 5th week, O'Connor says that the majority of the Bureau's 13,000 agents are working all without pay, and morale is plummeting to piss bucket low. Agents continue to work cases, but O'Connor said the shutdown be slowing FBI investigations, and it'll only get worse as it drags on. Field offices in New York, Dallas, and Newark have set up improvised food banks as well. This is the guys in the KGB, what's now called the FSB, over in motherfucking Russia, are living fat. Your FBI agents won't be able to stop them from ripping your country apart because they're too weak with hunger. Employees are walking into their supervisors' offices in tears, asking for help. Others fear they'll be unable to make payments that be due and potentially fail one of the Bureau's routine financial background checks, which would cause them to lose their security clearance and with it their job. With 5,000 of the Bureau's approximately 35,000 employees on furlough, all vacations have been canceled, requests to work second jobs are rising, and retirements are being delayed. Kevin Brock, a former assistant director of intelligence who worked at the Bureau for 24 years, confirms it be unrealistic to expect that agents could go without pay for long. He said, "When you're raising a family on a government salary, you're off living, if not from paycheck to paycheck, with a thin margin of savings, particularly in the cities where we're living, it can get tight." Field agents are based in major cities around the country, of course. At the outset of their career, agents in the New York area earn roughly $65,000. By the time they retire, they earn at most $130,000 approximately. The highest-ranking FBI executives are paid $190,000 annually. The long-term fear be that given that the private sector pays more than the Bureau, the FBI and other federal law enforcement organizations will both lose experienced agents and be unable to recruit new ones. So Nathan Couture, the president of the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, which represents 26,000 officers in the FBI and dozens of other federal agencies, he told the Washington Post that the level of frustration, I don't know how to articulate it, it's so high right now, people don't want to come to work. They're not being paid, they don't want to come in, I can't blame them. The shutdown comes as the Bureau struggles to defend itself from unprecedented allegations of political bias from a sitting president. After decades of efforts to distance themselves from the spying and harassment of the J. Edgar Hoover era, the vast majority of agents pride themselves on being apolitical, focusing on facts and the even-handed application of the law. Agents say that the FBI's effectiveness, from fighting crime to countering terrorism, depends on maintaining the American public's faith in the Bureau's independence from political interference, bias, and abuse. But the Trump presidency, from the Russia investigation to the federal shutdown he caused, is putting enormous pressure on the institution. Trump, as usual, is the loudest voice in the motherfucking room. As news reports have continued to focus on the Mueller investigation, the president has continued to make false and misleading claims about the Federal Bureau and its former director, James Comey. On December 16th, yesteryear, Trump falsely accused the FBI of illegally breaking into the office of his former attorney, Michael Cohen. He tweeted, "Remember, Michael Cohen only became a rat after the FBI did something absolutely unthinkable and unheard of until the witch hunt was illegally started. They broke into an attorney's office. Why didn't they break into the DNC to get the server? Or the Crooked's office? A federal judge had, in fact, issued the FBI a search warrant for the Democratic National Committee. Now, on December 18th, the president falsely claimed that the Bureau had intentionally deleted thousands of texts between the former FBI agents, Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, who had both been fired. Trump tweeted, "Biggest outrage yet in the long, winding, and highly conflicted Mueller witch hunt is the fact that 19,000 demanded text messages between Peter Strzok and his FBI lover Lisa Page were purposely and illegally deleted, which would have explained whole hoax, which is now under protest. In fact, the Justice Department's Inspector General found that the Bureau's automated system for collecting messages from staffers' mobile phones had failed. Why did it fail? Because of Russian hacking. And all that because the FBI can't afford the countermeasures to cyber terrorism. And they no longer have the ability to protect themselves. And as a result, the Russians can strike, take them out, and Trump takes advantage of that, all designed to protect himself as Putin's puppet and keep the Russians in occupation of your empire, the United States of America, under Republican collaboration with the enemy. This is why the Republican Party has to die. This is why the Republican Party must be declared illegal as the Communist Party. Trump's attacks have divided the community of former agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigations as they have divided the nation itself. Some former agents support Comey and see Trump as undermining the rule of law and the pursuit of fact that FBI agents pledged to defend. Others criticize Comey and say that his call for Americans to vote for Democrats in the midterm elections and his handling of the Trump-Russia-Clinton email investigations made the Bureau appear politically biased. The reality was Comey had a sign on his front lawn that said, Trump Pence. This son of a bitch was servicing Donald Trump, did everything he could to get him elected, and then when things went sour, he became the scapegoat. He regrets everything he's done. It's too fucking late. He needs to burn in hell eternal for what he's put the nation through. And Brock, the former assistant director, feels that the text messages between Strzok and Page, in which they disparaged Trump and opposed his candidacy, raise supposedly legitimate questions about the neutrality of the Bureau's Comey-era Trump-Russia investigation. So you've got all of this turning the FBI inside out on itself, cannibalizing itself, just as the military and its veterans have always done. Trump's attacks, meanwhile, are eroding public faith in the FBI while they eat their own innards alive, particularly among Republicans, the Russophile cult anyway. A Pew Center tracking poll found that since early 2017, the number of Republicans and Republican-leaning independents with a positive view of the Bureau has dropped by 16 points, some 65% to 49%. Democrats' opinion of the Bureau has remained steady, with roughly 76% of Democrats and Democratic-leaning independents regarding it favorably. Either way, the shutdown only adds pressure to Bureau administrators and agents who are trying to keep the FBI functioning and neutral in a Washington that grows more politicized by the day. So, being apolitical in no way, shape, or form has helped it. Basically, we're in a period, this moment in the history of the Bureau, the agency, being unprecedented. The Bureau's buffeted by public demands from a sitting president for the FBI to investigate his political opponents, politicizing the agency if ever there were an individual to do so, and demands from Trump's opponents that the president himself be investigated, and now no pay. The impact of all three on the Bureau will be unprecedented as well. It will not survive in an operational form, which is what the Russians want, so they can launch their attacks all out with no resistance. God damn them all to hell. Our Grand Madame, Ramona Halitha Henry, is leaving us for the night. God bless her. My love be unto her, of course, and of course unto all who support her and all she does for us. I want her to understand just how much she means to us, and I want people to certainly take advantage of the links that she's put up on her Gold Star post. That will help acknowledge her for her contribution, and to acknowledge government workers in well, who normally, I feel, don't deserve an iota of sympathy. I now will suggest some ways you can help them. Yes, you can assist federal workers impacted by the shutdown. The federal government shutdown came about because of politics, but its repercussions are hitting average citizens without regard for partisanship. Hundreds of thousands of government employees, many still required to come into work, are turning to food banks and other programs to make ends meet. The national park system, airports, and even the space program have all been impacted. Meanwhile, average citizens are stepping up to help those in government service who are not getting paid. They're also volunteering to take care of national institutions that ordinarily rely on government employees. There are many opportunities for you to make a difference. There's the United for U.S. Fund. The United Way has set up the United for the U.S. Fund, a joint effort by labor unions, corporate partners, the United Way Network, and nonprofits to help federal workers, contractors, and others impacted by the shutdown. Local United Way chapters are providing financial services, counseling, and, where available, emergency help with rent, food, and other basics. The United Way says 100% of donations to the United for the U.S. Fund will go to the affected parties. Check it out. Then there's Feeding America. Feeding America is working with a network of food banks to support affected families. On their website, you can pledge money or enter your zip code to find nearby food banks where you can donate or get help yourself if you need it. Feeding America, look it up. There's the Capital Area Food Bank. Capital Area Food Bank is the largest anti-hunger organization in the District of Columbia area. Typically provides about 3 million meals monthly. In January alone, I know it's done so. This year, the government shutdown is increasing demand on the organization. Capital Area Food Bank partners with over 450 local organizations. If you're in area, you can check it out, see what you can do to help. Then there's hashtag Chefs for Feds. Hashtag Chefs for Feds organizes food trucks, chefs, nonprofits, and businesses to provide meals for those impacted by the shutdown. You can donate money, time, or other resources to their cause. Hashtag Chefs for Feds is run by World Central Kitchen, a national nonprofit organization that strives to eliminate hunger and poverty. They deserve support. There's the Greater DC Diaper Bank. In the next 2 weeks, the Greater District of Columbia Diaper Bank plans to distribute over 200,000 diapers. That's far more than what the group anticipated just a few months ago. The nonprofit says every dollar donated provides up to 8 diapers. The organization also collects and distributes women's hygiene products. Very important. Check them out. Help out the ladies as well as the kids. Then there's the National Parks Foundation. Some of our nation's most scenic national parks are suffering from overflowed garbage bins, unkempt bathrooms, and trampled paths. Without staff, a complete assessment is impossible. But the National Parks Foundation is organizing volunteers and accepting funds to help parks recover once the shutdown ends, if indeed it ever does. Now, being a trained historian, all of this didn't start with Donald Trump. And you know that. It really started with the assassination of several men that dominated the alternative political landscape at a time when they alone pioneered an actual alternative. We don't have an alternative political landscape anymore. We've got the motherfucking Russians on top in the overworld, and we've got goddamn Michael Aquino running the alternative media from the underworld. So you've got it fucking you from both ends, one through your mouth, one up your ass. The only person trying to help you out is Douglas Dietrich, which is why he's attacked relentlessly. In this last hour, we might take another towards midnight my time, if my executive producer can stand it. We're going to try and beat this out as a subject without making it that full period of time. But then again, we only got an hour and 15 minutes. We can handle it towards midnight my time. In attacking myself, we have a history of why this would happen. The kind of pioneering political individual that I am harkens back to the days of Malcolm X, Malcolm Luther King Jr., and George Lincoln Rockwell of the American Nazi Party. All of these individuals were assassinated. At that time, the revolution in society that would have taken place to make men separate and equal the way Malcolm X and George Lincoln Rockwell wanted it within a community that would accept men of mixed race heritage like myself, as Martin Luther King Jr. envisioned it. All of that died with those men and others being killed, such as, of course, Joseph Oak, the Mohawk, the man who was responsible for the American Indian colony on Alcatraz Island. And all of that is a tragedy that's just beyond description. So with Richard Oakes, the Mohawk, the American activist, I always thought of him as Joseph because I was thinking of Chief Joseph, the Native American, which, of course, my father often hearkened back to when he spoke of himself, George Joseph Henry Dietrich. His name Joseph actually sourcing from that. He had always been so told or even so slandered. When I think of Richard Oakes, the Mohawk, of course, that could take us in a totally different direction that I don't really want to take it right now, but he will come up in terms of the horror that was his life in context of the narrative that I need to provide to try and give you some context as to why the Native American situation is congruent with what we've had happen in the world of assassinations in the 60s through the 70s that destroyed America's future. At that period of time, America as a potential simply ceased to exist. And all of that reminds me, of course, of all of the Christianity that I've been speaking of, all of the biblical history that I've been referencing. All of that brings us to the horror of the whitewashing of Martin Luther King's assassination. 3 days after Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered in Memphis, soldiers were patrolling riot-torn Chicago. The death of Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't a galvanizing event, but the premature end of a movement that had only just begun. With himself, with Malcolm X, with George Lincoln Rockwell, and Richard Oakes the Mohawk. Now, an individual calling themselves Worldly Traveler on my YouTube video, the latest transmission prior to this one, presented that another controversy regarding Dr. King's legacy was that he fought for the civil rights, not the human rights of African Americans, that civil rights be granted to a person by the state and can be taken away, whereas human rights are those that a person be born with, and these can never be taken away by the state. That's certainly appreciated. Unfortunately, it's very much a philosophical standpoint and not a legal standpoint and therefore becomes very difficult to enforce. As a result, what we have going down is a situation where realistically King had to focus on civil rights so that there would be an enforceable change in society, whereas the human rights promoted by Eleanor Roosevelt were a philosophical basis for a new order of humanitarianism. And when we confront the kind of situation that we have been suffering from in terms of the wretched of the earth, it's easy to see that it's been almost impossible to take Eleanor Roosevelt's ideals and turn them into a reality. So, for that very reason, we need to focus on that which we can accomplish in a manner that'll truly change the world around us, and then we can try and make that world stabilized so that the new world order that we've introduced of a just and lasting peace can become the norm. Now, when it comes to Jesus's rebuke to the Pharisees, the quote specifically is, "Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and 'twas your ancestors who killed them." As sure as Jesus' words proved prescient about the adoption of Christianity in the empire that killed him, so too the modern-day legend of Martin King writes itself in real time. In the official story told to children, King's assassination is the transformational tragedy in a victorious struggle to overcome. But in the true accounting, his assassination was one of a host of reactionary assaults by an empire hell-bent against a revolution. And those assaults were astonishingly successful. Revisiting those assaults requires a walk through the pandemonium of the last years of King's life. There be perhaps no better Virgil for this task than James Baldwin, a man with close friends in every ideological corner of the civil rights movement. Among them, his prophetic spirit found kinship with King, young Martin, Baldwin called him, whom he first met in 1957 in Atlanta. Baldwin understood viscerally the course that King had to travel. He predicted the dangerous road before Martin Luther King in a 1961 article for Harper's Magazine, adding that King has incurred the grave responsibility of continuing to lead in the path he has encouraged so many people to follow. Baldwin noted in the essay that King intended to lead a movement by incorporating the struggles of his constituents into the very fiber of his being, becoming in a religious sense the avatar of a people's plight. How he will do this, I do not know, Baldwin continued, but I do not see how he can possibly avoid a break, at least with the habits and attitudes, stratagems, and fears of the past. After the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, the year before I myself was born, the revolution's center of gravity shifted north, along with the stragglers of the Great Migration out of the South, of the black African Americans and many others, toward de facto, as opposed to de jure, racism. Baldwin's frequent premonitions of unrest in the streets began to come true. The year that I myself first laid eyes on this world, in his 1966 essay, A Report from Occupied Territory, Baldwin discussed the powder keg of poverty, joblessness, and discrimination in urban ghettos and warned that it may blow up. It'll be a miracle if it doesn't. King, by then, had sensed the same trouble brewing in the slums as Baldwin had. In his 1966 campaign against segregated housing in Chicago, which moved his strategy of nonviolent protest from the south to the north, he tried to weld his activism machine against the social and economic troubles that Baldwin described. He was repaid with violent counter-protests. King spoke of a white lash, a white backlash, a term he helped popularize to his movement. But in retrospect, the strength of the reaction he predicted and enjoyed oft receives short shrift. The support of white moderates who recoiled at images of Negro children sprayed by hoses and attacked by dogs, those whites whose stomach was just too soft to tolerate that was instrumental in passing laws that ended legal segregation and protected voting rights. But by the year I entered this vale of tears, 1966, it had become clear that many of these whites chafed against further activism and greater demands for equality. They viewed the Voting Rights Act as a final concession. King saw it as a start. According to Gallup polls, King's popularity waned in the coda years of his life. His unfavorability rating reached 63% the year I was born, 1966. The year Star Trek was launched as a franchise by the great humanist Gene Roddenberry, who did his best to promote both a-religiosity, because he felt religion was the cause of so many of our ills, when looking at the white evangelicals of the United States, and promoting racial intercourse, literally by a kiss between William Shatner and Lieutenant Uhuru. I remember her as a character, and I remember William Shatner as the actor, much to my embarrassment. And, of course, I'm going to have to look up Uhuru's name as an actress. My head held in shame and disgrace over that, that I have to look that up at all. And, of course, that is Lieutenant Nyota Uhura, and she was played by Nichelle Nichols. And so the lovely Nichelle Nichols at that day and age was, of course, kissing Captain Kirk in scenes that basically set the world on fire in terms of protest and backlash against our man Gene Roddenberry at the time. All this in the year I was born, in dealing with issues that are coming back to haunt us now when I'm over half a century old. They shouldn't even be, how is this still a thing? They shouldn't even be issues at this point in history. Half a century past this time of strife, violence, and assassinations in the waning years of these men's lives that I'm trying to describe. Because at that time, 1966, public opinion turned firmly against the civil rights movement. Now, as moderates abandoned him, King also faced a resurgence of the more virulent elements of white supremacy. The Klan firebombed the Forest County, Mississippi, NAACP leader Vernon Dammer to death in January 1966. That's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples that I'm speaking of. And if I remember correctly, Klan night riders were suspected in the murder of the activist Clarence Triggs in Bogalusa, Louisiana, later that year. The Klan was joined by newer organizations across the United States that became emboldened in the late 1960s. The National States Rights Party, for one, incited a violent riot in Baltimore and spread its organizing arms beyond the South. The visibility of the American Nazi Party increased after the Voting Rights Act was passed, until its leader, George Lincoln Rockwell, was assassinated himself on the 25th of August in 1967. At King's Chicago marches, the counter-protesters wore not the familiar hoods of Klansmen, but the swastika patches of Nazis, because, of course, they were siding with Malcolm X in the concept of blacks and whites working together towards a separate but equal status, not understanding at the time that both worlds could coexist, which is the kind of world I myself advocate. One for those in New Africa and a new confederacy in the South, and one for the rest of us, those like me, which more and more are becoming as unto, generally in the North, with many an expanded Native American reservation and one exclusively for whites throughout the West and the Pacific Northwest. Now, when it comes to that period of time, of course, we're still coming up to the time when Alcatraz was occupied by the Native Americans, which I'm not going to go too much into. It's just too painful. But heading towards that year, 1969, I remember that by 1967, when I was 2 years of age, I don't consciously remember this, but I know historically, resistance to further change among the white majority had ossified, and the Negro, as the term was used then, the Negro powder keg that Baldwin had mentioned, had blown up, and then some. The youth and student movements that King had at times managed to corral were starting to oppose his church-based Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They gravitated toward the Black Power movement, black nationalism, and violent tactics. That year, the long, hot summer brought death and destruction in Detroit and riots in at least 6 other major cities. An article that summer by the legendary journalist Ethel Payne in the black-owned Chicago Defender described King's race against time to defuse the ticking bombs of impatience in the big cities. 2 months later, King told that same newspaper, "All the signs of our time indicate that this is a dark hour in the life of America." The Kerner Commission, established by President Lyndon Baines Johnson's administration to investigate the causes of the 1967 unrest, said plainly that racism was a major factor. Its 1968 report, authored by the commissioners, who were firmly rooted in mainstream racial politics, concluded our nation is moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate, and unequal. But Gallup polls showed that a majority of Americans disbelieved that conclusion, and Johnson largely ignored the report in future policymaking. The false tale of victory had sprung to life. White backlash, white lash, and Johnson's rift with civil rights leaders who wanted to push further than he did slowed the White House's efforts. Starting the year I was born, 1966, government sabotage and obstruction had begun to have an effect on King's campaign. Chicago's mayor, Richard J. Daley, had secured an injunction that August limiting when and how King could protest. The next month, a major housing bill had been allowed to die in the Senate, signaling a renewed pushback in Congress against civil rights. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover's fixation on King and his attempts to discredit the civil rights leader with salacious reports and gossip is now well documented. Reportedly, the FBI even sent him a letter with allegations about his extramarital sex life and a suggestion that he kill himself to avoid public disclosure. Also documented be the rise of COINTELPRO, an acronym, all in caps, the counterintelligence program, the FBI's program dedicated, in Hoover's own words, to neutralizing the activities of black nationalist hate-type organizations. According to Bureau documents, the program intensified its focus on King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1968 in direct response to his nascent Poor People's Campaign. And by 1968, King had emerged from a series of trials with an understanding of the full breadth of white supremacy and with no small despair at its depth. As he embarked on his Poor People's Campaign, he braved dwindling funds, a loss of public support, and mounting desperation among the people on the margins of America. It became clear that King embodied the final seal of the eschaton, the urban apocalypse, that Baldwin had warned about. A single bullet fired from a Remington rifle traveled through King's spine on April 4th. The revolution died with him, and the country caught fire. It would be no exaggeration to say that the atmosphere across the nation immediately following King's death carried a whiff of brimstone and end times. Thousands of black youths in ghettos across more than 100 cities spilled into the streets in sorrow and rage during the Holy Week uprising. Police arrested over 20,000 people, and neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore saw millions of dollars in damage. Estimates in Baltimore exceeded 10 million United States dollars. That'd be over 70 million United States dollars today. Nationally, amid pitched battles between cops and communities, reports of sniper fire, and conflagrations that consumed business after business, at least 40 people were killed, and over 3,000 were injured in the gravest unrest in America since the American Civil War between the states. King's assassination was the earthquake among a series of seismic shifts that demolished a certain portion of black intellectual and spiritual movements. Baldwin had been working on a movie script about the life and assassination of his friend Malcolm X, an effort that had been fraught owing to Baldwin's desire to explore the deep, lingering racial questions left in the activist wake. King's assassination helped derail that project and sent many other surviving intellectuals of the civil rights movement on trajectories that veered away from black activism completely and into self-destruction. Personal self-destruction. The landmark year of 1968 almost saw the death of Baldwin himself. He overdosed on sleeping pills in what his biographer, David Leeming, implies was a suicide attempt. In the immediate aftermath of King's death, the intensity of the cataclysm became clear to all of black America. 3 days after King's murder, even as the fires across the country raged, Baldwin and King's friend Nina Simone took to the stage at the Westbury Music Fair on Long Island. The show had been scheduled long before, but now it had new meaning. Simone sat down at her grand piano. She sang, "Will My Country Stand or Fall? Is It Too Late for Us All?" Her voice wavered between venom and sorrow. And did Martin Luther King just die in vain? The lyrics, writ by her bassist and first rehearsed with her band that afternoon, painted a picture of Simone's own deep sorrow, as well as her lamentations for the brokenness of the world. Simone paused to reflect on the recent onslaught of black deaths. "Do you realize how many we have lost?" she asked the audience. Among the martyrs of the movement, there had been George Lee, Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, 4 girls in Birmingham, a trio of Freedom Summer activists in Mississippi, Jimmy Lee Jackson, Arliss Jackson, and 3 students at South Carolina State University. More than 120 people had been killed in race riots that broke out from the long hot summer through the Holy Week uprising. W.E.B. Du Bois had died an ancient man in exile in 1963. The very year my late sister was born. Lorraine Hansberry had died of pancreatic cancer in 1965, and Malcolm X had been assassinated not long after. John Coltrane had died of cancer in July 1967, and Otis Redding's plane had crashed into Lake Monona in Wisconsin that December. The intensity of all those losses was staggering, and King's assassination was the knockout. After a last gasp in 1968, nonviolent resistance receded as a national change-making strategy. Baldwin chronicled the shift in an address to the World Council of Churches in July of 1968, saying that leaders such as the Black Panther Party's Stokely Carmichael had grown weary of petitioning a heedless population, and said in effect what all revolutionaries have always said: "I petitioned you, and you can petition for a long, long time. But the moment comes when the petitioner is no longer a petitioner, but has become a beggar." By the way, thank you, Daniel Arola. He reminds myself that bass, the instrument, it's pronounced bassist, I believe, or so he says, and I'm sure he's right. He's the musician, not I. I'm deaf in my right ear, and I'm quite atonal. So thank you, Daniel Arola. Deeply appreciate it, brother in battle. I can use all the corrections I can get when I embarrass myself by my syneticization of the English language. Now, even the ascendant Black Power movement at that time, even those who had decided to choose the path of violence, even they couldn't withstand the might of the American status quo. In 1969, Chicago police and the FBI killed the Black Panther Party's deputy chairman, Fred Hampton, dealing another blow to hopes of a visionary leader. The FBI's continuing program of disruption, along with increasingly hostile public opinion among whites and the rise of law and order politics, had effectively destabilized the Black Power movement as a legitimate change-making force by 1970. Ever since, black activists have often been marginalized and widely discredited. Now, of course, during this period of time, I myself was barely coming into consciousness when we came into San Francisco, myself and my family, arriving at that time in what could only be defined as a war zone, disembarking at the San Francisco International Airport, the largest in the world at the time, I believe, maintaining, as many airports do, their own jurisdiction and constabulary to police it. We got there early in the morning on November 20th, 1969. Simultaneous to our arrival, 79 Native American Indians of the IAT, the Indians of All Tribes, broke and ran a United States Coast Guard, a military branch of the U.S. Armed Services, not a police agency, concurrently deployed during those years in Vietnam on riverine and estuary combat patrol duties. So the blockade of Alcatraz Island was manned by men who likely had combat experience. Yet the Native Americans successfully broke their blockade, invaded and occupied The Rock, Alcatraz Island, under hostile white American fire, like back in the old frontier days of cavalrymen and Indians. Now, of course, Alcatraz had originally been used by their indigenous forefathers as a place of isolation or ostracization for tribal members who had violated a law or taboo, and inevitably as a hiding place for many Native American Indians attempting escape from the genocidal Spanish, later Mexican, California mission system. Once Alcatraz Island became a U.S. federal prison, both military prisoners and civilians were incarcerated there. Among these were many Native American Indians. The Rock forcibly became an international Native American melting pot. The largest single group of Indian prisoners sentenced to confinement on Alcatraz in one influx occurred on January of 1895, when the United States government captured 19 Moki Hopi as prisoners of war and shipped them to the Rock. Native American peoples continued to be confined as prisoners of the United States in disciplinary barracks on the Rock until the early 1900s, shortly before World War I. The IAT, the Indians of All Tribes Amphibious Landing, served as the vanguard for what was to become thousands of Native American Indians of many First Peoples nations who followed to occupy the abandoned remains of Alcatraz on basis the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, signed between the United States and the Sioux 100 years before, that returned all retired, abandoned, and out-of-use federal lands to the native peoples from whom they were acquired. And since Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary had been closed on March 21st of 1963, the year my late sister was born, and the Rock had been declared surplus federal property in 1964, the island qualified for reclamation. But as always, the United States refused to honor her word, a reflexive historical pattern that the First Peoples referred to as the Trail of Broken Treaties. And the ensuing United States siege of Native American Indian-occupied Alcatraz from 1969 through 1971 was to spellbind myself over its duration. Of course, I was identified as Native American, and I grew to admire the man who had both organized and personally led the initial IAT task force through the United States Coast Guard live fire, to take hold of the Rock, facing a far graver immediate challenge than George Washington ever did while crossing the Delaware. So former ironworker Mohawk Richard Oakes, he struck me as a natural leader, handsome, charismatic, talented, educated at the San Francisco State University, an establishment I myself would later attend in young adulthood in my emulation of he for 2 semesters of political science, a true exercise in futility. as by then the department was simply an indoctrination mill in communist ideology, but nonetheless. Oakes was immediately identified and maligned by the American media as the instigator of a foreign invasion on American soil, the chief of the island, the mayor of Alcatraz, but he had control of Island Amerindia from the very moment he literally hit the beach. With an organizational council put into effect immediately, everyone arriving thereafter had a job, including security, sanitation, daycare, schooling, cooking and laundry. And of course, they were able to survive for a great period of time on the basis of foreign aid, in the sense that the Japanese fleet had ships as well as the Soviets and the Communist Chinese that were going to take action if America invaded Alcatraz, because they were looking to recognize it as the Native American Indian government in exile. Native America's version of what my own true homeland and heartland, Taiwan, became to the Nationalist Republic of China, as relocated to the 100 Islands of Formosa. So the Americans couldn't militarily invade Alcatraz to take it back. But the American Army was still institutionally committed to Indian pacification by over a century of frontier warfare. The United States government was still dedicated to a policy instigated by Harry Solomon Ship Truman when he realized he couldn't beat the Japs and he had lost World War II. He could only take it out on one population that couldn't fight back, the Native Americans, and he instituted a policy of termination of all tribes. By the time President Richard Mulhouse Nixon was in power, termination of all tribes was still the official American policy. So because the American military couldn't invade out and out, as that would be an act of war that would provoke a response from the Empire of Japan, Communist China, and the Soviet Union, then what happened was, instead of allowing a splinter culture to develop as had happened on my native Taiwan, the Native Americans were going to be taken out by destroying their leader's heart. So what had happened was a man who later admitted to myself, after I had known him for some years, as both a total degenerate and at the same time the man who taught me everything I knew about mercenary work that would enable myself to make my own fortune in the world. Before, of course, I had to expend it all in care provision for my parents. A U.S. Army Ranger sniper, Lionel Allen Curtis, infiltrated the island as a representative from what was back then known as AIM, or the American Indian Movement. They sent representatives to Alcatraz Island. They were one of the Red Power activist organizations that represented many tribes. Their delegation was to establish their presence ashore in a show of regional people solidarity. I was damned to find out in my later years exactly what had happened to break Richard Oakes' heart. His daughter was murdered. What happened was, first, of course, January 3rd, 1970, Oakes' 13-year-old daughter mysteriously fell 3 feet on a stairwell to her death, breaking his heart and his will, and prompting him to abandon his people, openly vulnerable without his inspired leadership for the mainland, to take his daughter home to bury her. I later found out from Lionel Allen Curtis, U.S. Army Ranger sniper, he had raped her and murdered her under direct orders, for the results so calculated to manifest. Because that's how the U.S. Army fights. By late mid-1970, the United States shut off all electrical power and all telephone service, and the Coast Guard intercepted and interdicted all water barge services, which provided fresh water. 3 days following the federal military denial of water barge runs, a fire of disputed origin was set on the island, destroying several historical buildings. That was Lionel Allen Curtis covering his own escape in an inflatable raft he had brought on island for just that purpose. Yet against all odds, the Native American Indian occupation continued to persevere, apparently paddling secret night runs by canoe to keep minimal supplies of fresh water breaking through the blockade. On June 11, 1971, President Nixon lost all patience and ordered a large air, mobile, amphibious combined services operational invasion force of armed federal marshals, FBI agents, and San Francisco Special Forces Police, SWAT, Special Weapons and Tactics teams into action. They couldn't deploy the military, so they made it a police action. They swarmed the island and forcibly removed all the Native American Indian men, women, and children ashore, all of whom proved to be totally unarmed. Some 50 of the Alcatraz occupiers escaped captivity and made for the East Bay, where they commenced the Native American Indian national occupation of a secret Nike missile installation hidden in the hills behind the community of Kensington. In other words, what happened was many of them had been in the military, many of them had manned the anti-ballistic missile system, the Nike missile installation, back in the day when they were serving your constitutional republic, a secret base known only to those who had been in the military. They broke into it, conquered the base. Their occupation was ended after 72 hours by a combined services force of Richmond police and regular United States Army troops deployed from the Presidio military base of San Francisco. Now, because my family, like so many others, had base access privileges as military dependents of an armed services retiree, my father actually took me to the Presidio parade grounds to watch the mobilization for this deployment. He wanted me to personally witness the rendezvous for what he feared might become one of the last massacres of a vanishing race. A race, of course, he was convinced I was related to, going to his grave believing, of course, myself his biological son. Richard Oakes himself barely survived an assassination attempt shortly thereafter, languishing in a coma for over 30 days. Only the sudden appearance of his mentor, the spiritual leader Wallace Mad Bear Anderson of the Iroquois Confederacy, was credited by friends and witnesses as bringing him back to life. But before I was to enter my own 6th year of mortal life in a world I never made, on September 20th, 1972, at 30 years of age, Oakes the Mohawk was shot and killed by a subhuman, a white trash piece of shit named Michael Morgan, a YMCA, a Young Men's Christian Association camp manager with a history of child rape directed against Native American Indian children. In this day and age, such a recidivist would be placed on a national and publicly accessible watch list, as well as theoretically barred from employment in child-responsible vocations. But in 1972, this baby-raping piece of shit had all charges ordered dropped against him within 6 months, and Michael Morgan returned to work to rape more Redskins, as he said he was going to do. This was my personal Kennedy assassination, an unacknowledged outrage ignored by America's Caucasian population, amid a nationally proclaimed era of civil rights. A childhood of being attacked and beaten by strangers as a Redskin myself had robbed me of any innocence and generated a longing to escape to a refuge of my own kind that was to prove totally illusory. So I'm reminded of all of that when I think back on Martin Luther King and Baldwin's reflection on how the white Americans whitewashed not just anything he might have accomplished, but everything he represented. The powers that be decided they no longer wanted any part of Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy or those who would follow in his footsteps, and they carried out that decision with finality through violence, sabotage, political marginalization, public antipathy. Those powers included every agent of white hegemony, from protesters who fought against the integration of neighborhoods, to police who jailed King's compatriots for marching in the streets, to politicians such as Alabama's George Wallace, who stood in a schoolhouse doorway to stop black students from entering. King's work had been titanic, but white supremacy proved the iceberg. It also proved flexible, able to accommodate changes in public opinion, the erasure of segregation from the law, and the advent of affirmative action, all without ever ceding any discernible power. In a 1969 essay for the New York Times Magazine, Baldwin reflected on how that flexibility had become the hallmark of the world after King. He wrote, "If white people be prepared to blow up the globe in order to maintain that faith of their fathers which placed Sambo in chains, then they be certainly willing to allow him his turn on television, stage, and screen. It be a small price for white people to pay for the continuity of their domination." And part of that price included reconciling American values with the fact that whiteness and the state had colluded to end King and the Revolution. For white America, hostility towards the civil rights movement turned into a cherry-picked celebration of the Revolution's victories over segregation and over easily caricatured gap-toothed bigots in the South. Embracing King became a way to rejoice in overcoming and to reify white innocence, even while ignoring the cries of those who had certainly never overcome. Accordingly, the life of King passed mid-1965, a radical 3 years spent fighting a tide that had turned against him, is never mentioned today. This selective history was cemented in the establishment of Martin Luther King Jr. Day by President Ronald Reagan in 1983. Ronald Reagan, it should go without saying, was about as far from King on the ideological spectrum as a politician could get. He worked to erect a new set of boundaries around urban blackness, which Baldwin had foreseen decades earlier. Reagan had bought into the whitewashed version of King, an image rehabilitated for white consumption and black mollification. In his speech announcing the holiday, Reagan mentioned King's support for colorblind justice and quoted that most oft-quoted portion of the "I Have a Dream" speech. But Reagan never mentioned the remarks he had made as the governor of California on the day of King's funeral, when he had spoken of a great tragedy that began when we began compromising with law and order and people started choosing which laws they'd break, in effect blaming King's own campaign of civil disobedience for his assassination. Nor did Reagan mention that a majority of whites had felt the same way and that many of them had hated King. No mention either of the last 3 years of King's life other than his death. In a 1978 retrospective article on King, Baldwin looked back at his friend's life and at how the country had changed since his murder. And Baldwin wrote, "A vast amount of love and faith and passion and blood have gone into the attempt to transform and liberate this nation. This is not the land of the free, is only very unwillingly and sporadically the home of the brave. And all that can be said for the bulk of our politicians is that if they be no worse than they were, they're certainly no better." And how much has changed in the 40 years since that retrospective? Have politicians improved? If King were alive today, would he bask in the glow of achievement, or would he gird himself again to march? We've been halfway through hell since the manicured National Mall was trampled by onlookers who'd come to see American democracy's quadrennial spectacle, this time for a man becoming president of the United States as hacked in by the motherfucking Russians who'd been endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan. And it forces myself to consider one last question. Is this what enemy victory looks like? Total Russian white supremacy. And now it's week 4, going into 5 of the shutdown, and Americans still know Donald fucking Trump be to blame. There be no immediate end in sight to the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. Now, if I'm counting right, on day 36 or so, Thousands of federal workers were forced to go without a paycheck on Friday, and Americans continue to hold President Trump responsible. And in line with polling conducted before Trump's national address last Tuesday, 4 new polls show that Americans overwhelmingly blame Donald John Trump and congressional Republicans for the partial shutdown. We've got a Quinnipiac University poll found that 56% of voters hold Trump and congressional Republicans responsible for the shutdown. The poll didn't ask about the two separately. An additional 36% said they thought congressional Democrats were responsible. Only 2% of voters in Trump's national address changed their mind about building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. 89% said it did not. 55% of Americans blamed Trump for the shutdown, while 32% pointed their fingers at congressional Democrats, according to a CNN SSRS poll. Respondents were not asked whether they blamed congressional Republicans. The poll also found that most Americans did not support Trump's proposal to build a border wall. 56% said that they opposed the wall. 39% said that they were in favor of it. Those numbers, of course, are essentially unchanged from 1 month ago. And as for a CBS News YouGov poll, whom they blamed the most for the shutdown, 47% of Americans said Trump. 30% said Democrats in Congress. Just 3% blamed congressional Republicans. But 20% of Americans placed the blame equally on all parties involved. The poll also found that a large majority of respondents were either very or somewhat concerned about the impact of the shutdown that it would have on federal 74% on transportation and air travel, 62% on maybe that, and 71% on the economy. Now, when I go over this, I'm left astonished at how this man is just not set on fire while alive in the White House. Honestly, an ABC News Washington Post poll found that 53% of Americans held Trump and congressional Republicans responsible for the shutdown, while 29% blamed Democrats in Congress. 54% said they opposed the building of a border wall, a 9-point decline from a year earlier. So the pollsters found more mixed views when they asked about the situation at the border, depending on how the question was framed. A majority of the respondents to the CNN SSRS poll, 52%, said they didn't consider it a crisis, while 54% of the Quinnipiac poll respondents said they believed it was a security crisis along the border with Mexico. Meanwhile, the CBS News YouGov and ABC News Washington Post polls provided respondents with a more nuanced answer choices to the crisis question. 55% of respondents in the former said the situation was a problem but not a crisis, while 47% in the latter, a plurality, said illegal immigration across the U.S.-Mexico border was a serious problem but not a crisis. So is Trump's strategy of keeping the shutdown, the government furloughs, going, unless Democrats vote to fund his border wall, is conclusively not helping him at all politically. Since the shutdown began on December 22nd, polls have found a slow but steady decline in Trump's net approval rating minus disapproval rating. And according to 538's presidential approval tracker, on December 21st, Trump's net approval rating stood at minus 10.5 percentage points. That's 42.2% of Americans approved of his job performance and 52.7% disapproved. Since then, Trump's net approval rating has dropped to minus 13.7 points, with 40.8% approving and 54.5% disapproving. Unless Trump can change the narrative of the shutdown or reopen the government, imagining public opinion of him improving be difficult. And so I could speak in this last half hour of impeaching Trump now, but I'll save that for another time very shortly. But that's what needs to be done. Starting the process will rein in a president who's undermining American ideals and bring the debate about his fitness for office into Congress where it belongs. Now that I can go into detail of in the very near future, if not my next transmission, sometime soon. But what I can address in the last few minutes left to us going towards midnight here in California is, of course, my narrative and what I've been presenting to you that becomes so fraught in the lives of those who attack me that they've gone to the point that the FBI went to with Martin King Jr., except they can't go in the directions they did with Martin King because I've never presented myself as a saint. And what they're responding to, it's always important to remember, this must never be forgotten, is not my narrative. They're responding to your narrative. Because all I provide are the facts. And when I provide you those facts with moral umbrage and outrage, all that does is expose to you the reality that you get nowhere else in this world. So when I provide this to you, this reality no one else knows of, that is nevertheless that reality you all should know of. America's losing the Second World War and all of the corruption thereafter to maintain itself in a paedopathocracy under military junta, leading us to the point where we're at today under Russian occupation, in order to prevent you from facing up to this terrifying reality. The Aquino cult and the motherfucking Russians and the military junta in between them will do their best to try and discredit myself. And yet, look at what I exposed to you about America losing World War II. Simply compare with common sense the quality of life on each Asia-Pacific front. And in Japan, that empire, the empire that won World War II, you have the highest quality of life in the world. There are no contenders. The Empire of Japan manifests the highest quality of life in the world. In the peninsula that once was part of Japan, where for many decades there was no such thing as Korea, there was simply the Chosen Peninsula of the Greater Japanese Empire. Divide it in twain, bifurcate it between communism and capitalism. The difference between the qualities of life of North Korea and South Korea on either side of the demilitarized zone, standing today while they're still in an active state of war against each other, only now begin to talk of peace. The quality of life is night and day. In the North Korean peninsula, the quality of life is not worth living. In South Korea, it's a quality of life on par with that of the Japanese Empire. And that's a product of a war America lost. The North Koreans supposedly won, but in the end, what we know is that it was a fact of political compromise. And it led to exactly what Emperor Hirohito wanted. First, the war, which remobilized all Japanese industry to put it once again on the productive level it needed to be to compete in the world scene exactly as Hirohito wanted, which is why he drew the Soviet Union into the invasion of Manchuria and halfway down the peninsula before he detonated the nukes, the atomic landmines in effect, the shells, the ordnance shells, the uranium shells equivalent to the Hiroshima bomb, known as little boys to the Americans. They created the demilitarized zone, which stands between the Koreas today, and atomized, literally disintegrated, the Soviet advance towards Japan. And of course, now the Soviets were stuck, the Americans were stuck, war was waged, Japan's industry was remobilized, and it was en route, once again, towards re-entering the community of nations and dominating worldwide industry. Then you have a place called Vietnam when you go out of Northeast Asia down south, and in that third Asia-Pacific front of warfare, when the Japanese had, of course, set the Vietnamese on the road to resistance, maintained units on active duty in Vietnam which defeated the French, carried the Vietnamese to victory against French colonialism, then the Americans counter-invaded, and ultimately, of course, as was inevitable, as with the British in Malaya, fighting the Malayan race's army, which you can look up and verify yourself, all used Japanese weapons, wore Japanese uniforms. All the British propagandized this as a communist insurgency and said it took an enormous amount of resources to defeat it. By the time these Japanese insurgencies were defeated, the British declared victory and retreated to the other side of the Suez Canal, out of the Indian Ocean, and out of world affairs for effectively several generations. Until Margaret Thatcher decided she was going to war with the Argentinians. And when you had the Americans in Vietnam, I agree with the Marine Corps analyst who wrote the book Unheralded Victory, that the Americans won on all counts the Vietnam War. That you had a political defeat. And this started, of course, with Richard Nixon and his own demise politically. The Vietnamization of the American war in Vietnam, as the Vietnamese know it. The Vietnamization of the war per Richard Nixon's orders and the withdrawal of troops in 1973 in force. All this was in defiance of the fact that the Americans had accomplished the overwhelming majority of their military objectives, including the overall destruction of the Viet Cong in the Second Indochina conflict, to be followed by the third when Communist China invaded. When the Americans withdrew, there was no military loss. With their allies, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese, the Americans had militarily won their objectives in maintaining Republic and its independence from the North all the years that they were there. On their withdrawal, then the North Vietnamese invasion took place, and the North Vietnamese declared this victory. That's as farcical and as ridiculous as the Americans claiming they won World War II. And yet the Americans acknowledge a Vietnamese victory and claim the Japanese lost the war. And yet if you go to Vietnam, its third world level of existence is orders of magnitude beneath the quality of life you find in South Korea or Japan. So how can anyone say, looking at the quality of life suffered by the North Koreans and the Vietnamese, the declared victors in their wars, that they won wars, whereas the so-called losers of the war, South Korea and Japan, have the quality of life that everyone in the world is aiming for as they develop into a modern nation state? Simple common sense tells you my narrative is not my narrative. My narrative is your narrative, which the people running your anti-reality, your entire sense of antithesis to reality, those people have run that through your brain, and you know it's all bass-ackwards, upside down, or you wouldn't be here listening to me. So that alone makes me the most dangerous man in the world. So those who reject and attack myself are not attacking myself with any faith in a reality. They're attacking myself based on contrafactual anti-narrative. Now, when we take a look at the kind of unreality that a lot of you are dealing with, I'm reminded, of course, of several people that come to mind, whether they're bringing up facts, of course, in support of myself, or they're bringing up some kind of assault or attack. Everybody is making assumptions. And sometimes these are logical assumptions based on what information people have. But all too often, these are entirely illogical assumptions that are based on emotions that are triggered by the facts that I present. Now, when I've spoken of many things, like the historical reality of artilica, or ancient artifacts in the Japanese islands, the Japanese Empire, then what I'm trying to bring to people's attention is a reality that no American has ever been made aware of, and yet can research themselves independently. So there are people who have been very supportive of what I've exposed about that reality. One of them was Arthur Jarrett, a shout out to he. And he wrote myself in a very supportive comment, talking, of course, about the artilica in England and ancient Albion that was manifest in an analog to the Muramasa blades that are so intriguingly alluded to in popular cultural films like the DC Comics-based film Suicide Squad, in which the character Katana is portrayed by a Japanese-American actress, Karen Fukuhara. And Karen Fukuhara plays this character Katana, who has in her possession a Muramasa blade which has taken the life of her husband. She now welds the blade, but as I was saying, the artilica become gene-locked. They're even producing animated series with that very term, gen-lock, which I've stated in past transmissions. All this based on the concept that the weapon responds to either the individual user or to only people of a certain race or genetic composition, meaning that the weapons respond ethno-specifically. Beyond that, the weapons, of course, in the case of the Muramasa blade, any great warrior will make their weapon an extension of themselves. The curse of the Muramasa blade is that you become an extension of the blade. The character portrayed by Karen Fukuhara in the film Suicide Squad is so much an extension of her blade, she no longer even has a name. She's simply referenced as the blade, katana, which is the Japanese word for samurai sword, the baseline samurai sword, as opposed to other variants. So that same film presents us with the reality or anti-reality condition that you're living in. One of the things I spoke of in my latest transmission, prior to this one, was Gerard and Mandy Miller, who, of course, became entirely obsessed with the Joker and Harley Quinn mystique. So I thought of them as well when Arthur Jarrett wrote me a very supportive comment speaking of my mentioning artilica in Japan and saying that the analog in ancient Albion or the British Empire was Excalibur, and that the king himself became an extension of the blade, that the blade thirsted for blood. I don't know if it was to that extreme of the Muramasa blades where one would kill others or oneself, sans any form of real control over themselves because of the need of the blade to be blooded. But I'm not that familiar with the British mythos as I am with the Asian cultures of Japan and China. But when I think about modern popular films that actually can do so much to actually enlighten us in terms of a kind of condition, Suicide Squad not only did that with Karen Fukuhara as the character Katana, it did so with the Joker and Harley Quinn, which was a character couple trademarked by DC that inspired the poor mind-controlled couple that came to kill us all at the Super Soldier Mind Control Summit, arranged by Laurie and Ann Fenton for just that purpose, so that we would all die. The fact that she probably would have died with us never entered her fat head, because that's colluded with all of the fatty tissue between her ears, and beyond that, she's so programmed by Michael Aquino, she's beyond caring. But when they showed up and I turned them away, our man, executive producer Pavel Pravara, provided me a link to an article that said Gerard and Mandy Miller killed and 3 other people died. What they were referring to was the 2 cops and the 1 idiot with a concealed carry who was waving it when the LVPD came storming in after Gerard and Mandy Miller had killed each other and they killed him. Those were the 3 other people that died. He and the 2 cops who may not even, I'm convinced, were not even killed by Gerard and Mandy Miller. They most certainly did as I thought they would after the instructions I gave them. They went out and killed themselves. Now, altogether, when that went down, and then we still have films like The Suicide Squad come out, there's a condition that's similar to what you all suffer from, kind of parallel to what Gerard and Mandy Miller did. They were under very direct mind control, products of an MK Ultra program. In the film Suicide Squad, you see the Joker portrayed by Jared Leto, which I think is probably the best portrayal of the Joker ever done. Margot Robbie portrays Harley. She was incomparable as well. There's no one who can match her because no one ever did it before. So when these 2 portrayed the couple that they did so as the standard. They set the gold standard for whoever else portrays that power couple, the Joker and Harley Quinn. But there was something that was brought into the creation of the Suicide Squad that the majority of you don't know about, and it's not fan theory. There was enough footage filmed of Jared Leto as the Joker to make a second film. Hopefully someday that will be released. From what I hear, it never will be. But what it gives is a condition, or portrays, is a condition that in a very real sense you all suffer from as Americans trapped in an anti-reality, a matrix of falsehood that you did not generate yourself but grew into. The concept of Suicide Squad was that there was the original Joker that many of us older people saw in the hokey-tacky Batman series that used to be on in the 60s and the 70s with Bruce Wayne portrayed by a man named Adam West. Now, Adam West had a radio voice. And Adam West, his nemesis, the Joker, was a much older man. And the concept of all the footage filmed of Jared Leto as the Joker in Suicide Squad was that old man was the Joker, the original Joker, the real Joker. And that this younger man, with the word damaged tattooed across his forehead, was really a creation of Harley Quinn, who had fallen in love with that original Joker, had grown obsessed with the original Joker, and created her own by using one of Batman's old Robins. Because Batman in the DC franchise goes through Robins like other people go through queer whores on the street if you were in San Francisco. Like other guys go through escorts or prostitutes. There's been, in the comic book franchise as officially produced by DC Comics, multiple Robins. You can look this up if you don't believe me. So, in terms of the Batman that was produced in the franchise of films. It was supposed to be one of his cast-off Robins that was abducted by Harley Quinn, pretty much brain-fried with electroshock therapy, and recreated in her image of the Joker as a younger man that was literally her Joker. All based on her experience with the original Joker. Now, all of this was part of this enormous amount of footage, which you can verify for yourself was indeed filmed. A lot of footage that is, for a number of reasons, not being released. And many of you are like that Jared Leto Joker. You're a creation of someone. You think you're someone that you're not, when you were actually someone else. You're basically, as a national culture, as a mass identity, growing up in a psychotic delusion that you won the Second World War against the Japanese. The closest you came was, of course, in conjunction with every other allied nation on Earth, the major colonial empires of the day, from the Soviets to the British to the French, in combined arms, forced the Third Reich into exile and into Unterland, which is exactly what Adolf Hitler was striving for anyway, to relocate his Nordic Aryan master race into a sterile environment, sterile or free from Judeo-corruption on the surface world. His victory was total and complete, and he got exactly what he was aiming for in terms of his objective to achieve an environment in which his master race would evolve free from the influences of capitalism and communism and Judaism. In this total loss of the Second World War in defeating your Axis enemies, you think you won total victory, and you will die to maintain that delusion of anti-reality. So when I present you reality, I am constantly the terminally deranged based on case history, which you do not have. So when I'm confronting you with that reality, the resistance becomes violent. And the resistance of so many of you is not even logical. The man who apparently has replaced Richard K. Cole as my gang stalker, Niall Parkinson, demanded in messages sent to my executive producer while I was transmitting to know where Unterland is. And yet I've explained this multiple times, that Unterland is the crust of the earth globally, as it carries within its crust, via water erosion, massive lacunae connected by multiple tunnels, some now man-made and reinforced, and many quite natural, eroded over millennia, aeons of time. Unterland is not anywhere in particular. Its caverns may be, but the caverns are throughout the subsurface of the earth, 17 at least that were identified at the time of the relocation of the Reich, each the size of the Grand Canyon. Many hundreds of smaller subsidiary caverns aside as well, all expansion for cities in Unterland, with a population maintaining itself in these enclosed environments, stretching from the northern polar regions through accessible caverns in Tibet, through those that are accessible through the Antarctic. All of that is the lands below, which is what Unterland means. If someone doesn't understand that concept, which I've spoken of at length, there's simply no hope. And when it comes to questions about my latent sainted Cyrus and her meeting with Adolf Hitler as a teenager in a position of such responsibility, Again, you're viewing this from your perspective of reality, which is total anti-reality and insanity. The rest of the world, particularly that which operates on the monarchist system, such as Imperial Japan or Germany of the Kaisers, operates on children who are born into majesty and royalty, being assigned responsible positions as military officers in their very young teens. This is why you have people who are barely into adolescence, who are in uniform and in command on the field in monarchies where those of the royal bloodline are trained to take on such responsibilities from birth. They're literally born to rule. If you can't understand that, you don't understand the reality that's been active for thousands of years within the most proven form of government in human experience, the monarchic reign of dynastic bloodline. Children that are gifted in Asia are automatically given positions they wouldn't dream of giving someone in the United States or in the West at a similar age. Beyond which, my mother's physical maturity was much faster and farther because of her non-human bloodline. Her Chinese father, as I said, was vampiroid. She herself was half so, a dampfire, and I am a quarter so. Physiology is not the same. When we were much younger, we looked much older. As immature and physically developed, and as we get older, we tend to look much younger, at least for a longer period of time. And with the stress that's gone now that both my parents are dead, and finally all my stress is stabilized in general, I'm able to reclaim much of my youthful looks that otherwise would be impossible without extensive plastic surgery. My medical cosmetologist helps. My bloodline makes it possible. It's a confluence of factors which the majority of you repel at. You simply say, I can't believe it. I can't believe the vampirism. I can't believe the monarchy. I can't believe the Uterland. You attack every individual thing you can, and all your attacks fail. Because my narrative be consistent, because it's not my narrative. It's yours. It's reality. It's a reality you simply have been denied of. Because you're not yourself. You're raised in an insane asylum of the mad to believe a fantasy that's impossible. So with that, we'll close this transmission for now. What I do aside from beating history into you is essentially counsel you towards a sanity to rehabilitate you from the madness you were raised in the most abusive and dysfunctional of environments unimaginable. And with that, there may be a hope for yourselves and for us all, because I'm stranded here among you. And as someone who, whether or not you believe it, there's no meaning or matter. What matters is your military junta believes in that which I've exposed, and they decide everything in terms of their objectives and agendas and actions based on their beliefs, using your tax dollars. Their belief in the anti-gods negates any disbelief you have in them. Their belief in vampires negates any disbelief you have in them. Their belief in the children of Adolf Hitler, compounded unto you by the historical reality of individuals I myself have brought up, like the son of Adolf Hitler, confirmed by the West German historian at the time when there was a West Germany, the Hitler biographer Werner Maser, who, of course, dealt with the young man named Jean-Marie Horæ, the son of Charlotte Laboy, the French lover of Adolf Hitler, whom we know was Adolf Hitler's son because Adolf Hitler personally traveled back into France to see that this young man got a position as a high-ranking French police official cooperating closely with the Gestapo. After the fall of France in 1940, this young man was personally ordered, traced down by Adolf Hitler, who personally came to France and signed a French police form, which is the only form we have historically that provides us Adolf Hitler's middle name, Jacob. Adolphus Jacob Hitler, which otherwise no one historically would have known. That Hitler came to provide this young man that. And then what I present to you of myself. All of that is the only reason the United States government would have monitored myself so closely all these years to exploit me for propaganda purposes if they were ever to expose myself as Hitler's son, or to destroy me should I go rogue. But since everything went wrong, and in his hubris, Michael Aquino, who is going to make Adolf Hitler's son the preeminent servant of the anti-gods, lost to that very individual myself his Vox Arcana and the Artilica, which could destroy all his aspirations and anyone else's. Then are you all stranded here to listen to me expose unto you the reality that's been hidden forever, functionally so as far as your lives are concerned, and all the decisions made by your government on the basis of their beliefs in vampires and Hitler's children and Unterland, using your tax dollars, prove you to be the lunatic, the idiot, the ignoramus in the world around you. Because you still pay money to people who operate on all that which you deny. How big a fool must you be? And then when I share that with you, you try to discredit the messenger. Maybe not you personally. And even the government can't officially deny it. So it's up to the guerrilla warfare of the pedophiles, in thrall to the pedopathocracy, the military junta, to forge documents because the government can't issue them officially. And the end result is, so far, a massive failure in discrediting the son of Adolf Hitler, your only hope to get you out of this sewer of shit, which you've been swimming in since before you were born. Blessed be for tonight, my love unto all who support myself, and join us again when we return on Sunday transmission.